Okay, I'd just like to start by introducing my dear friend John Martinson, who I've known for how many years?
30 years.
30 years, and he's arranged this shoot this morning. And I was invited up here to speak at Bismarck State College and give a talk. And well, this is in preparation because my book, Final Charade, hopefully will be completed in the next year and will be published somewhere. And I was given opportunity to talk, and I only had 60 minutes to talk. And the question was, what was I going to say? Now, I included some new material that's never been made public. And the reporter did a great job. She picked up on this new material and wrote this interesting story. But what she doesn't know, and none of the audience knows, is this new material is nothing compared to the stuff that I cannot talk about that I already know and have concluded. And that's why we're doing this project, to put on the record years of research that I've already done, conclusions I've reached that I can't talk about because the public would laugh. And I don't want to get into a situation where I'm subject to ridicule because I haven't built my case a step at a time. So first is going to come my next book, Final Charade, which is the sequel to Best Evidence. And Best Evidence said that the body was altered before the autopsy and changed the facts of Kennedy's death. And the question then and made it look like Oswald did it. And then the book I'm working on now, Final Charade, is who was Lee Harvey Oswald and what is he doing in Dealey Plaza? But the great irony is that there's this whole other layer, which I can't even talk about, but we're going to talk about it right here in this camera. Now, one of the things this lady said in her story, Scholar discusses his JFK conspiracy theory, is first of all, she notes inside the administration of John F. Kennedy was the embryo government of Lyndon Johnson, and that's true. And I'll be developing that in a future time. But as far as the shooting of Kennedy is concerned, what I said, and this little cat that got let out of the bag yesterday, was that arrangements had been made to bring the president to a medical facility to remove bullets and alter wounds. Why? To create the false appearance that Oswald's rifle was the murder weapon. So this is not just an ordinary murder, and this will be in Final Charade, of course, the next book. This is not an ordinary murder where the president gets shot. He not only gets shot, but arrangements have been made to alter his body within 30 minutes, 40 minutes of the shooting, so that by the time they have an autopsy, it's going to look like Oswald's rifle was the murder weapon. So it's a plot with a built-in cover-up. You not only shoot the president, but then you falsify the story of how he died within 30 minutes or 40 minutes, and it's all done as follows. They bring the president into the hospital. He's been shot dead. He is absolutely DOA, deader than a doornail, but doctors involved in this say, oh, you know, we can save his life. Bring him up to the OR. And they pretend he's alive when he's dead. That's what we call this whole section of my new work, DOA. They pretend he's alive when he's dead to get him up to the OR, and under the guise of clinical surgery to save his life, they're going to take out bullets and alter wounds and prepare the body, you might say, quote unquote, prepare the body for the autopsy. Okay, so that's going to be revealed in my next book, Final Charade, DOA. And that's going to make it very clear how the autopsy was supposed to be falsified. It didn't work out that way. They couldn't pretend Kennedy was alive when he was dead because Jackie got into the room and other things went wrong. And because other things went wrong, they had to leave Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, without an autopsy. And the Secret Service, with guns, forced their way out of the hospital with the body. And that's why all this craziness happened at Love Field before takeoff, because they had to get to that body before it got to Washington. They had to alter that body or Oswald's not going to look like he's guilty. This whole project with this aspect of the Kennedy assassination started in 1971 when I went to Dallas because I was aware of the fact that so many people in the record, in newspaper interviews, seemed to say the car stopped. So I went to Dallas and I interviewed 5 witnesses, and they all said basically the car stopped during the shooting. This is before the Zapruder film became available. And I recorded these interviews openly, and they're now at the National Archives under seal. So the bottom line is that from the beginning, I knew the Zapruder film was altered. As it turns out, there's many films that are altered in this case. They had to get the films to hide what happened during the shooting. So the way this whole thing started for me, this journey into this particular hell, this subset of facts which deal with this weird business of what went on in the car, it started with the more fundamental puzzle, or the easier to solve puzzle of how come the witnesses said the car stopped, but the Zapruder film doesn't show the car stops? And did they really say the car stopped? So I went there and verified for myself, yes, they said the car stopped. And we can get in a side shoot sometime the different witnesses who said the car stopped. That's been published and it's argued about on the internet. the argument being, well, the Zapruder film doesn't show the car stop. Well, yes, the Zapruder film has been altered, and all the films have been altered. And that's the way the puzzle started, that the films were altered, and the wounds were different on the film, and the films were altered in terms there's no car stop. And there's only one agent that runs to the car. Well, that wasn't the central issue in the beginning, although it's become more important as time has passed, that when you look back at those accounts, there's more than one agent running to the car, but only one is in the film. But the whole film has been altered, and I now pretty much know where the films were altered. But let's get to the business of film alteration in a little bit.
But let's talk about what could be one of the smoking guns in the Kennedy assassination, sure. And that's the foot that's hanging over the side of the presidential limousine. And I want to get your thoughts on that, because Clint Hill claimed before the Warren Commission that that was his foot.
Yeah, well,
that he was
you played an important role here. You took those pictures. Why don't you just say you took those pictures to an orthopedic surgeon? Well,
okay.
It looks weird, but what happened when you took the pictures to an orthopedic surgeon?
Well, okay, I can tell you that I've been suspicious about the foot. And as you know, early on, right after the assassination, when the Associated Press printed their story, they claimed it was Kennedy.
Yeah.
And then the press later changed their mind after Clint Hill testified before the Warren Commission that it was in fact Clint Hill's foot. But that foot, to me, never fit in alignment with Clint Hill's body.
Right.
And so I brought the photograph to an orthopedic surgeon because I needed to have a professional opinion based upon his work with bones, joints, etc.
Sure.
And I gave him that photo. He looked that over. He had that in his possession for a week. He spent a lot of time with that photo. And his conclusion is there's not a chance that that is Clint Hill's foot.
Right.
So I've talked to you about, okay, if it wasn't Clint Hill's foot, and if it clearly isn't Kennedy's foot,
right,
whose foot is it? Do you have an idea of an opinion?
Absolutely. And what you've done and the work we did with the foot has a lot to do with the Godzilla hypothesis. Because what happened is, and I don't know the exact date of this, but when I realized, probably because of the conversations with you, okay, first of all, why did this photograph get through the net? They altered so many pictures. Right. These photographs were taken by a high school kid who developed it in his basement.
And that was David Miller.
David Miller. And David Miller then gave it to the Dallas newspaper the next morning, so it was already published either November 23rd or November 24th. Mm-hmm. So he got through the net, and there's the foot sticking out.
And he made that available to the Dallas Morning News?
Either Morning News or Dallas Times-Herald.
Okay. So they got that directly from him?
Yeah, right, and they published it. Okay. Nice big picture, and there's this foot. So in the beginning, there was this idea, well, maybe Kennedy was at some angle, and his foot was sticking out. That doesn't make any sense. And then there was the idea that it was Clint Hill. Now, later, when I realized they were shooting in the car, for months, I don't know how long, I'd have to check my records on the Godzilla files. How many months was it, or years, did I actually believe that once an agent, whose name is Paul Landis, I'm sure, took over the wheel, that what do they do with that body in the front? And before I re-examined the Zapruder film, I thought, well, maybe they threw him in the back. Mm-hmm. They stopped under the underpass, and maybe it's his foot. I no longer believe that. It's clearly, to me, that there's another person in the front seat of the car. So whose foot is it? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, when you look carefully, and you realize that more than one agent ran to the car, another one of the loyal agents on the right running board is John Reddy, R-E-A-D-Y. And John Reddy was standing on the right front running board in front of Paul Landis. And he ran to the car too. Now, how do I know he ran to the car? Because there was a witness named Norman Similis, S-I-M-A-L-I-S, of Canada, and he was right by the car. And he was interviewed by a Canadian newspaper over the phone, and it was published in the New York Times the next morning. And his account, which of course bears no relationship to any film, because these films have been altered, he says he's right there, the car stopped, an agent ran up to this is on the passenger side, opened the door, and said, my God, he's dead. Okay? That's in the New York Times the next morning. Okay.
So you were talking about Norman Similis, very close to the car.
Right. So close, he said, in an article in a Canadian magazine subsequently, so close that he could kick the wheels, kick the tires. Oh. And I'll talk about Similis because he doesn't show up in any film. And I'd like to talk about why he doesn't show up in any film. And he's been called a fraud. He's not a fraud. Okay. In pursuing the FBI reports of the witnesses in Dealey Plaza, and there's so many of them, and it's very easy because of the focus on other things to miss a report. But in one of the earliest FBI documents, they're called field reports, where they collect them. So they collect everything they have as of November 30th. They submitted it to the FBI headquarters. That's called the Gemberling Report of November 30th. Then comes the next report. the gambling report of December 10th. These are like 500, 800-page reports. One of the witnesses on a courthouse, standing on a courthouse balcony on Dealey Plaza, says she looks down and she sees an agent throw himself into the car. Throw himself into the car. That's John Reddy, and that's his foot, I'm sure. Because it's not Clint Hill. Clint Hill didn't throw himself into the car. He just got up on the bumper.
Right.
And there's
and then into the back seat.
Yes. Correct.
Right.
But he didn't throw himself. So that was a great find. I found that in the last year or so, and so I'm convinced that it's John Reddy, who's, I don't even know if he's still alive today. I tried to reach him. He's over 80 years old, and he wouldn't come to the phone. But anyway, I think that's John Reddy. So I think he threw himself into the car. Now, when you look at the Zapruder film very carefully, and there's some folks in L.A. that have some special equipment, and I've spent some time with them, but I also looked at my own copy. And there was a fight. When the agent threw himself into the car, Connolly doesn't know who's good and who's bad. So he got into some kind of a fight with the agents in the car, with the agent. And anyways, the car pulled away. I think Reddy was face down and his foot was sticking out. And as they passed the trademark, by that time his foot was vertical. And there's one account of a witness who says as the car passed by, one thing he noticed as the car whizzed by was his foot sticking up vertically. So that's that same foot.
Okay.
But
Right.
by this time it's sticking up vertically.
Right.
And I think it's Reddy's foot. And I think by the time he reached the hospital, Reddy got up out of the car, and I don't think he was seriously injured. And he probably did have a fight with Connolly. And in fact, Mrs. Connolly said in some document or in some letter that she wished they would, she was hoping they would stop hurting her husband. Anyway, somehow during this melee, Connolly got shot 3 times. As we know, he got shot in the chest, in the wrist, and in the thigh. And we're not here right now to go into Connolly's wounding, but the point is he got shot as a result of this fight in the car. And anyway, the truth of what happened in the car has never been told because the films have been altered. And the films have been altered to prevent anybody from knowing that there was an inside job. I mean, that would be the justification for Robert McNamara, and probably with Bobby Kennedy's approval. If we let this stuff out, or if anything like this gets out, that it's going to look like an inside job. The Russian military will say the American government just had a coup. The reason for this is they're going to launch. We have to launch first. That's the dynamic, the psychological dynamic of what's going on in the hour after the assassination and the justification for a cover-up. So you could, using plain street talk, Lyndon Johnson turned the lemons into lemonade, because without this, you have other problems to cover up. And what's the justification for covering up this and that and the other thing? Well, they had a great justification, because this idea of a rogue agent that has to be covered up to prevent the Soviets from thinking. Of course, if you want to go with that logic, sure, you want to hold that for 30 days, 60, 180 days, a year, but there's no justification for years and decades later. This whole history has been falsified as a result of hiding this whole event.
So the original plan was not to have the driver shoot the president.
Of course not. The original plan is to have the driver drive slow during the kill zone. Kennedy gets hit in the head, gets brought to the hospital. He comes in on the level. They slap a mask on his face. I'm a diabetic. I know what it is to have a breathing mask. I use it every night. Connect him to a respirator. Oh, we're trying to, save him. Press the button, go up to the OR on 4th floor or 5th, whatever it is. And then you have the craniotomy, the hospital craniotomy. That's not a pathological craniotomy, it's a clinical craniotomy. We're talking about an ordinary neurosurgery. And then this announcement is made, well, we're sorry, he died in surgery. And the world would know that Kennedy died in surgery. Okay? Then the body, having had the bullets removed and having had the wounds altered, and it's not a big a deal, okay, goes down to, now you press G. As Sean Federer said, you go up to the 4th floor for your operation. Now he's pronounced dead. Now you go down to G, which is the basement, you go to pathology. You turn it over to the forensic pathologist for an autopsy. He does the autopsy, and he says, well, President Kennedy was shot twice from behind. Here's the draft of the autopsy report. Bobby is flown in from Washington to accompany his sister and the body back. Here's a preliminary draft of the autopsy. And by the way, Oswald was your agent. Have a nice life and go screw yourself. I mean, that's what this is all about. That's the way it was supposed to unfold, but it didn't.
So the original plan was to have the shooters in the front, to set up Oswald as the assassin from behind,
right.
And included in the original plan was to have JFK's body taken up to surgery. That's where they were going to remove the bullets.
Right.
But that didn't happen because Connolly was shot.
Correct.
And
there's an agent who was shot.
And there was
the
an
car
agent
comes
that
in
shot.
with 2 unexpected victims. You got a body to be hidden. The agent is shot, and you got Connolly. And here's the great irony: we are now at the 50th anniversary of the assassination. One of my discoveries that I made, that I am sure proves that I am correct about this, is that the Dallas Morning News, the day after the assassination, the first edition of the Morning News, says that President Kennedy died in surgery in a 6th-floor operating room. I love that story. And there's a second story, that the president was being moved to surgery. This is in the 11/23/63 Dallas Morning News. And I got it on microfilm, and I put it in my records, and I'm getting it ready, so when my book is finally written on this thing I call Godzilla, I have it ready. Well, guess what? Because of the 50th anniversary, they've reprinted that edition of the Dallas Morning News. It's all over Dallas. You can buy a copy for $3. Somebody mailed one of them to me. There's the story that Kennedy died in surgery, and no one has noticed it or knows what it means. And it's circulating all over Dallas as we speak. A story that people probably say, oh, well, it didn't happen that way. I guess some reporter made a mistake.
Yeah.
Hell no. That was the official story that was going to go out, that was printed by accident, even though the event hadn't occurred. And now it's been reprinted on the 50th anniversary, and there's thousands of copies circulating around Dallas.
How ironic.
Yeah, that's great. I just love that part of it.
So all the pre-planning resulted in the assassination not going the way they had wanted it to go. There were a number of problems, as you pointed out. Tell us a little bit about that. You believe that Kennedy was supposed to be transported to an ambulance along the way and then taken to Parkland Hospital.
Yes, yes, this is really a good point. Back when I first came up with these discoveries about the idea that there was going to be surgery on the body at Parkland Hospital, they're going to delay the pronouncement of death, pretend he's alive when he's dead, and okay. Well, when I was first researching all this is back in the 70s, okay, and I was researching all this. I had the Dallas police radio tapes from Mary Farrell, the legendary Dallas researcher, and I had my headset on. I was a ham radio operator. I was making my transcripts and well, there were these transmissions on one of the channels. Clear the way for the ambulance going to Parkland Hospital. This is after the assassination, and then some officers say, well, what's this about? What ambulance? Well, the ambulance carrying the president. And well, there's no ambulance here carrying the president. This is another event that didn't happen that was supposed to happen. So then I get more evidence that the Parkland Hospital operator is notified by the Dallas Police Department that the president is arriving by ambulance. So there was a plan to transfer President Kennedy. Okay, the car comes out of Dealey Plaza and starts going up 7th Street Way and passes in front of the Trade Mart where he was supposed to speak. There was a plan to have the car swerve over and transfer him to an ambulance to get him away from his wife and aides. Because this is all about controlling the body. Once he's dead, first you got to shoot him to make him dead. Secondly, then you got to get control of his body and bring him to where you want to bring him, to the operating room, whatever. They want to get him away from Jackie, away from O'Donnell, away from all those people. So they were going to transfer him to an ambulance. And what's great about this ambulance transfer hypothesis, it's not a hypothesis, is that before the assassination, minutes before, there's other radio transmissions in which the police captain in charge of the Dallas Trade Mart is radioing to the deputy police chief, Stevenson, of the Dallas Police Department. Tell Stevenson, they use numbers, I'm just using his name here. I forget his name. I'm not sure the name of the guy at the captain, I think it's Talbot, but I'm not sure. Tell Stevenson the ambulances have arrived. The ambulances have arrived. Okay, Stevenson has now been told the ambulances have arrived. So there's this whole business of setting up for the ambulances as if, well, anyway, that's part of the setup. So they put the ambulances there, and then after the shooting, the dispatcher doesn't know that the transfer hasn't taken place. And I think he's probably part of the plot, the Dallas police dispatcher, which would make a lot of sense, by the way, because he's a central figure. He's the communications center. Anyway, so he's making these transmissions, clear the way for the ambulance going to the hospital. I mean, if I were a special prosecutor, he would be a person of interest, to put it mildly. I mean, you'd get him in a room before a grand jury, and you basically say, you want to go to jail? Well, tell me what you know about this whole thing. And that's the way you solved the Kennedy assassination decades ago. But of course, you can't do that, because if you say there's a conspiracy in this country, they think you're nuts. I'm lucky to have gotten this stuff published. But, yeah, he was supposed to be transferred to an ambulance, and they did not. So the ambulance transfer is an integral part. And what's really interesting is that the Dallas police tapes, which I personally believe have been altered, and I'll tell you why in a minute, the Dallas police tapes, they left that on it. Now, maybe the person doing the alteration wasn't that smart. I don't know. There's a lot of, you got to account for human ignorance. But by the way, 4 or 5 or 6, I think I have 7 witnesses who say that the first thing out of the mouth of in the lead car right in front of the president, and he's involved in the plot too, was surround the building.
The building. How would they have known?
Yeah, how would he know? Surround the building. Well, there's no such surround the building transmission on the radio tape. But Chief Curry is such a dope that he was proud of his transmission. And in December, he writes this report to the city manager. The first thing I did is I said, surround the building. I mean, what a schmuck. I mean, the guy said, surround the building. It's not on the tape. And there's a reporter in Dallas who hears it, and he was on the radio that afternoon. And the first thing I heard was Chief Curry said, surround the building. Well, surround the building is not on the radio tape. And I'm on one of those internet discussion groups with these sophisticated people. And this argument goes on that, well, if it's not on the tape, he never said it. But he did say it. That's why it's not on the tape, because the tapes have been altered. So this is kind of a high-tech operation for 1963. They were able to deal with the films, deal with the tapes, and basically re-edit the event as they had to. And in this case, they didn't. They took out surround the building. Now here's the other thing. The next thing Chief Curry says, which is the first thing on the tape, is have Parkland stand by. Well, that's interesting, because that's where they're going to go to have the operation. But it turns out Parkland is not the closest hospital. The closest hospital is Methodist Hospital. And it's a little bit closer. So nobody ever asked Chief Curry, because the Warren Commission attorneys, these guys, these legal eagles from, you know, Harvard and Yale, they don't know to look at a map of Dallas and say, oh, there's Methodist. They didn't ask him under oath. You know, what about Methodist Hospital? Did it ever occur to you that maybe you'd save a minute or two by going to Methodist? Well, anyway, the setup was at Parkland, and that's where they took President Kennedy.
Okay. Let's talk about Parkland Hospital for a bit. The big picture is that had the plan gone according to what the design was, they take JFK's up to surgery to perform, quote, life-saving surgery
right,
in order to remove the bullets
and get out and get alter the wounds.
And had that happened that way,
right,
would you guess that we wouldn't be talking about this? Would that have been successful?
Oh, absolutely. Because what happens next is then they mournfully announce that I don't want to make this sound like everybody's involved, because everybody is not involved, but Dr. Kemp Clark would announce that President Kennedy had died during surgery, which was reported, by the way, as I said before, in the Dallas Morning News on the first page of the November 23rd edition. And then they turned the body over to the local forensic pathologist, who's an honorable man named Dr. Earl Rose, who was brought into Dallas in May 1963, unbeknownst to him for this purpose. They didn't have a medical examiner system prior to this. They had to set this up. And it would be turned over to him, and Rose would have performed an autopsy. It's not rocket science in a case like this. You take the body, you count the number of wounds, it's like medical carpentry. They say, okay, if the Dallas doctors reported accurately from the emergency room, their observations would be confirmed, only they'd open up the body and there's the entry at the front of the throat, they'd find the bullet inside, they do the autopsy on the head, which is you part the scalp, and you have to use a saw, you take off the head, you get into the brain, and they'd say, here's the entry wound, and that would be the end of it. There's the report that President Kennedy was shot twice or 3 times, how many times he was shot in the head from the front, and that's the end of it. And that's the medical legal best evidence of the diagram of the shooting. And there's no way in the world that Oswald could be the assassin. Of course, by that time, the whole plot's fallen apart, because this whole thing turns on changing the diagram of the shooting to implicate Oswald's rifle in the assassination. That's what makes it look absolutely perfect case. That's why the establishment and the Warren Commission says, well, we've got the autopsy evidence. Well, that's not the autopsy that would have occurred if there was no body alteration.
Right. So despite the things that went wrong in the assassination, there was still an effort when JFK got to Parkland Hospital. He was dead on arrival.
He was absolutely DOA.
Clint Hill has said publicly he knew he was gone. There was still an attempt to delay the death, the announcement that he was dead.
Not an attempt, they did it.
They delayed the announcement.
They pretended he was alive.
Okay, because there was still thinking that they might be able to get him up to
that was the plan, to get him up. And they had phony medical treatments, because look, another way of stating it is this, is Paul O'Connor, the medical technician at Bethesda, put it this way to me, because by the time he gets the body that night, he said the cranium was empty. And he said, I don't believe they did it. This is Paul, who's very naive. In 1979, in my filmed interview with him, or 80, he says, I don't believe they did a tracheotomy. in Parkland Hospital. I said, well, of course they did a tracheotomy at Parkland. I mean, to me, the issue was whether it was a little thing or a big one. He said, well, I don't think they did a trach. I said, why not, Paul? He says, well, you wouldn't do a tracheotomy on a man without a brain.
Exactly.
I mean, and other people have said it. Pat Valentino put it this way. If you brought President Kennedy's body, as described at Bethesda, into any hospital, much less Parkland Hospital, you wouldn't do a tracheotomy. He's dead. So this whole business of, oh, he's really alive is nonsense. And the further evidence of the contrived nature of it, not only do you have this, this intubating the corpse, which, by the way, they use the Catholic excuse. I mean, I've spoken to these doctors, and I have this whole litany of what they thought and supposedly said. Well, he was Catholic, so they wanted to delay the pronouncement of death so they could have the last rites, and they always, you know, they try to blame the victim. Only this, they bring in his religion this time. He's Catholic and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that was their excuse. Now, they also called for chest tubes. Now, the doctor, I spoke to an emergency room physician the last month who said, okay, if a person needs a chest tube, you put in one chest tube. They had 2 chest tubes put in, one on the left and one on the right, to alleviate the breathing. There's only one problem with that, and it's a very serious problem. When the body gets to Bethesda Naval Hospital, the autopsy doctor reports that the chest tubes weren't pushed all the way in. They did not go beneath the epidermis. So you've got, it's superficial. You're supposed to push your chest tube all the way into the chest cavity. So this is make-believe stuff. So you have 2 doctors, one on each side, and I swear to God, if you could get in a time machine, I'd get them both before a grand jury and basically say, you want to go to jail or you want to tell the truth about what's going on here. One of them is still alive. He's the other one is passed on. I filmed them both. When I was with Dr. Jones in 1990, and I didn't have the full, I'm trying to remember what happened, but I pointed out to Jones on camera that the chest tube only didn't go beneath the skin. And he's head of surgery at Baylor or something. He says, I heard it pop. And I said to myself, well, maybe you heard somebody in the room, you know, popping bubble gum or something, but there was no, it didn't go into the chest and didn't go in. And that tells me that both were part of the plot. When I say that, I don't mean they're architects or anything. Maybe they're giving some cock and bull story that President Kennedy's, I mean, I've thought of these stories they used. President Kennedy's trying to kill a foreign leader. He's trying to kill Castro. Maybe Castro will try to kill him. If anything happens, we have a national security. I've wondered about the stories given to the Dallas doctors to get them involved. And one of the things I think they might have told the doctors is that there's a standby team. If anything happens to Kennedy, he's going to be brought to your hospital and just follow directions because we have to have a look at him before, you know, he's pronounced dead or something like that. But I'm trying to understand why, because I know I've met with Dr. Jones, met with him, had lunch with him, and filmed him. And when I finally understood that he didn't push the chest tube in, and I had that interaction with him, and he wasn't very happy about that. Peters was another example. He's became a well-known urologist. I don't think they devoted their lives to murder or anything like that. They were definitely, Peters especially, was a right-winger. One of them told me in 1966, Mr. Lifton, this is when I was a graduate student, calling him up on the phone and inquiring about the length of the tracheotomy incision. Tell me, is that Earl Warren, did they form this Warren Commission because the communist newspaper, the Daily Worker, said that, you know, Earl Warren should be investigating this? In other words, these guys are right-wingers. They grew up in Dallas, or they were in Dallas. They were in a right-wing community. They thought like right-wingers, and the anesthesiologist who had to know Kennedy's dead, he's an absolutely central figure in this, says to me at lunch with Pat Valentino that Kennedy was this president who let the boys down at the Bay of Pigs. So he was a political anesthesiologist. And his daughter, in 1980, she sees me with my book in a Hollywood function. She walks over to me, introduces herself. My daddy was in the room when President Kennedy died. I said, oh, who are you? What's your last name? And she said, she's a photographer, believe it or not. And she says, you shouldn't get too obsessed with this, David. And then she says to me, I just want you to know that on the anniversary of the assassination, my father and I drink champagne, or something like that.
Celebrating the death.
Yeah, that's the way it appeared to me. I mean, so this is the atmosphere of Dallas, and this is the nature of these doctors. And I think he was in this community where these doctors could be, in fact, recruited. And I think some of them were. And the central figure is Dr. The neurosurgeon, because he would have to do the hospital craniotomy. He would have to do the craniotomy.
And since that didn't happen at Parkland, it was critical that they get that body out of Dallas.
Absolutely.
Where they can, in fact, get to the brain, remove the bullets. So there's a confrontation at at the front of the hospital.
At the hallway, in
the hallway.
Right.
Between the medical examiner who is insisting that that body needs to be in Dallas for a legitimate autopsy.
Right.
And the Secret Service agents who say, we're taking JFK back to Washington.
Right.
And guns are drawn.
Well, that's what I'm told. Yes, it's in the literature.
And they forced their way out of the hospital.
Absolutely, yeah, and yeah, they did.
So
R.B. Reich was traumatized. R.B. Reich, the ambulance person who was there with the O'Neill Funeral Home, was traumatized by this. He never forgot it. When I spoke to him for the first time in March 1980, he told me about this whole business. I got a first-person account of how frightened he was with men with drawn guns and this confrontation between the Secret Service and the Dallas authorities about getting that coffin out of there.
So since the alteration of the body didn't occur at Parkland, they had to do it sometime between the time it left Parkland and the time it arrived at Bethesda.
That's correct.
So should we continue? You want to let's talk about the body on load at Air Force One.
Okay, before we get to that, let me just say one other thing about R.B. Reich. When I interviewed him in March 1980 on the telephone, and I interviewed him then in October on camera, and we'll get to the point you just made. I noticed that in a UPI story about R.B. Reich, R.B. Reich is told to UPI on November 23rd, he was told to stand by his ambulance because they were taking another patient away from Parkland. And I said, what's that all about? And he said, well, they were going to move President Kennedy to another hospital. And I said, really? And this is on camera. I said to him, why? What did they say was the reason? I mean, I was holding my breath for what would come next. And he may have told me on the phone, but I don't think so. I think this came right out on camera, and I've never used it. It's in the, it's on the master film. He says, well, President Kennedy was Catholic, and they had no nuns here. Again, the Catholic excuse. They're bringing up, and here's R.B. Reich, who's totally innocent, being told, he's 22 years old, he's being told, the president's going to be moved to another hospital because he's Catholic and there's no nuns at Parkland. Shows you how desperate these folks were getting, though. That was their plan B or C or D or whatever, to get that body out of there and get it to another hospital where they could do their little magic trick.
And since they couldn't get to the body to another hospital, they really started to fly by the seat of their pants, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
So at that point, I'm guessing they didn't have plan B. They were originating possibilities as the moments went by, I'm guessing.
I agree, John, because I think that these people were so arrogant that they didn't have a plan B and a plan C. I really think so, because you'd think that with all this planning, they would have a plan B. They probably thought, how can anything go wrong? The driver is going to be driving slow. We've got our men camouflaged. I mean, we're just going to be able to take them out with one shot. Who's going to ever think that everything can go to hell in a handbasket at Dealey Plaza, or that the seat is going to be pushed up at the... I mean, it's such a mess what happens, and to figure out this mess, you really got to look at this closely. It's taken me years. But you're right. Now they've got to figure out how we're going to get the body out of the coffin, because they've got to get it out of the coffin, and they better damn well do it in Dallas, because once you get back to Washington, D.C., basically you're in Bobby Kennedy's territory. He's the Attorney General of the United States.
Yeah, let's talk about the body then leaves in the ambulance with Jackie Kennedy and Clint Hill in that ambulance, and it arrives at Love Field. And
I'll tell you how I think we should structure this part of it. I think the story starts with Lyndon Johnson leaving Parkland Hospital. Let's back up a little bit, because if you start with the story with Bobby, with the Jackie frame of reference, you get pulled into the, we miss the preparation. So Lyndon Johnson, so now they finally have to say Kennedy's dead, which they finally say about 1:15. In fact, the LBJ Library document says 1:20, even though Malcolm Kilduff, the assistant press secretary,
had the press conference.
Unfortunately, I also think is involved in this dirty affair, because Pierre Salinger, the president's loyal press secretary, was on the plane carrying all the Kennedy officials to Tokyo for the so-called economic conference. So Kilduff gets up there and says, well, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. They backdate it. And the reason, it's very important that they backdate it, by the way, because otherwise people are going to say, well, what the hell are you doing with the body? Well, if, you know, he's so seriously shot in the head, what are you doing for 40 minutes? I mean, they don't want those questions. Anyway, they backdated it to 1 p.m. That's the announcement. The announcement is that Kilduff says at 1:35 that President Kennedy died at 1. In fact, when you look at the paperwork, Johnson is told at 1:15 or 1:20, Kennedy's dead. I mean, that's when they really have the event, and that's when they lose the opportunity. It's over. They can't do it at Parkland Hospital.
Okay.
So now Johnson goes to Kenny O'Donnell and says, I'm going back to Washington. And he leaves Kenny O'Donnell with the impression that he, Lyndon Johnson, is going to take Air Force Two and leave promptly for Washington, D.C.
Both planes were in Dallas at the time.
Yeah, both planes parked wingtip to wingtip.
Okay.
And that was what he said he's going to do. That's not what he did. Lyndon Johnson got in the car, and so he starts using his siren. And Johnson says, cut the siren. Now, what I'm about to tell you comes from Captain Perdue Lawrence, who's now passed away, a loyal guy, clean as a whistle, who was driving one or two cars behind, and he drove the car with Lady Bird, I believe. Anyway, I interviewed him on camera in 1989. So he tells me what happened en route. So they cut the siren, but they're going too fast. So in one of those side streets, somebody just comes darting out and almost smashes into Johnson's car. So if that had happened and Johnson had been taken out of commission, the result of all this would have been that House Speaker McCormick would have become President of the United States.
Right.
And Lee Harvey Oswald probably would have gone on with his life and gone to college and become the writer, which he wanted to be, which we'll get to that in a little while. Okay, so they get to the plane, and they run on board the plane, and Johnson immediately starts closing the windows on the plane and telling everybody, close the drapes, close the drapes. Now, I know all this because the Air Force people have been interviewed, and I know about what happened. And close the drapes, close the drapes. Now, by closing the drapes, you create a situation in which nobody inside the plane can see what's going on outside the plane.
Which was the idea.
Which was the idea. And nobody outside the plane can see what's going on inside the plane. And that's also the idea. So he's creating this isolated room in left field. So he's saying, close it. And he says, he makes it clear to the pilot, you are not to take off, that he makes it an act of chivalry. The reports read that President Johnson will not leave without the widow or the body. Let me tell you, he was much more concerned about the body than the widow. And he's not exactly a chivalrous person anyway. So that's what he does. So he's basically hiding on the aircraft. And they also take out seats at the back of the plane to make room for the coffin. Now, what I discovered much later is that more than 4 seats were taken out. They took out about 20 seats. Because they have to hide the body of the Secret Service agent. He's going to be turning out, that's that coffin at the front of the plane. And they get it on the plane. That's another story, but they turn it 90 degrees and put a tarpaulin over it, and that's called Lyndon's luggage.
And that's, when you say 90 degrees, it's actually upright?
It was upright when Chief Curry saw it.
It was upright.
Yeah, but then it's apparently rotated 90, and whether they took out about 20 seats in the passenger section of Air Force One. And that's why the passengers, some of them were resentful that why is Lyndon's luggage on our plane? I mean, but it's the body of the Secret Service. I mean, this gets very macabre.
Yes.
But well, let's focus on the tail compartment. Now, what you got to do is be able to get that body out of that coffin. And how are you going to do that? And I was prepared to show this yesterday at the lecture. I showed some of it. But it's really an amazing story. Here's the time elements, and we'll make a chart when we do this as a documentary film. The cream-colored hearse with the Kennedy coffin, Jackie Kennedy, arrives at Plainside. It leaves Parkland Hospital about 2:05. It arrives at Plainside at 2:14. This is an official Secret Service chronology. Someone's taking, as a matter of fact, Lyndon Johnson, during this whole period, was telling Lady Bird, he says, Bird, make notes.
Really?
I mean, when the predecessor dies, you immediately say, make notes. It's very strange behavior. So she's making notes. Anyway, they have the times. So it's 2:14. And they got the body on the plane by 2:18. So what happens is that that Kellerman is a really big, strong guy, and
he's at the front of the casket.
Yeah, he's at the front of the casket. And Lyndon Johnson said of Kellerman, and this is on tape, he's more loyal a person can be found, but he's dumb as an ox.
Dumb as an ox.
Yeah, but actually he's strong as an ox. That's what's really on his mind. And he's lifting this coffin.
The front end.
Yeah, front end. And the other clique of agents are lifting it up, and they get onto the plane. Now, everybody knows from the Stoughton photographs that Jacqueline Kennedy, some minutes later, is given the green light to come on the plane.
So there's a delay there.
There's a small delay there. But here's where the interesting part is, and why I'm saying the body was immediately removed from that coffin within a minute. Because once she gets on the plane, she sits down next to the coffin. Now, we're going to skip a lot of events here. Then there's a swearing in. Let's flash forward to Andrews Air Force Base. When the body is taken off the plane, it goes into a Navy ambulance. This is on national TV. That is, the coffin goes off the plane. Navy ambulance, national TV, and the plane is landed at 6 o'clock. The Navy ambulance with Jackie and Bobby leave at 6:10 and arrive at Bethesda Naval Hospital at 6:55. Problem is, I meant the coffin inside the ambulance arrives at 6:55. Problem is, the body has arrived at 6:35. So somehow the body got out of the coffin. And when you back time it, it has to have occurred at Love Field. There's no other way for it to have happened. So what must have happened is that as soon as they got to the top of the ramp,
with the casket
was lifted, and the body was then taken out the starboard side of the plane and onto a forklift truck that had to be set up. They had to prepare for this. So Lyndon Johnson had 30 minutes or something from the time he got to the hospital at 1:40 or something, and his group to set up and to find a forklift and to get somebody to drive the forklift. And the pilot of Air Force 2 told me that he saw a forklift truck stretched up against the side of Air Force 1. So that's what they must have done. And we'll talk about the dramatic new evidence in a minute, that in fact it was on the forklift truck. So they must have taken it out, and it's not in a body bag yet, so there's a blood problem, right?
So it's wrapped in a sheet.
It's wrapped in the sheets.
As it left Parkland Hospital.
As it left Parkland. And they got to get him out the starboard door, which is a half door used by the galley to put the food on the plane. So they had to have somebody on the forklift truck to drag him across the pallet of the forklift truck. And you had to have somebody inside the plane to push him out. And then they had to lower him and drive the forklift around the wing and over to the forward luggage area to put him in the forward luggage area, which I believe that's where he was based on other evidence. Now we get into the world of the blood evidence. Okay.
So let me just clarify a couple things. So they get the body out of the casket while Jackie Kennedy and the Kennedy loyalists are still on the tarmac or at the base of the steps. So they do that quickly.
And those photographs of Stoughton show them all down on the tarmac gazing up as the coffin is brought up.
Right. Yes. And so the Kennedy loyalists are still down on the tarmac. As they get this body towards the galley.
The coffin towards, they're on the tarmac, then they get the coffin onto the plane, and then they're still on the tarmac when they raise the lid on the coffin and get the body out of there and out the starboard door onto the forklift truck.
Okay. Now I'm guessing that the timing is really important because the Kennedy party can't see that body wrapped in a sheet on the forklift truck as it's moving. So they must go up the steps and into the plane as that forklift truck is moving the body to luggage. Is that the right scenario?
Yes and no. It was Sean Fetter's contribution, and I give him full credit. This is in the last month or two. He's the one that figured out if you keep the forklift truck in a raised position, you don't have that problem.
I gotcha.
So basically, they got him onto the fork, but with something more important about the forklift we'll get to in a business, and that's the back of the Kennedy's body and the deep abrasions and the scars on it, which we'll get to in a minute. But they put him on the forklift, and there's a blood problem created. And the blood problem is, first of all, Kellerman turns out to have a blood-soaked shirt from the neck down, and he's riding back in the cockpit on a jump seat. And Sean Fetter discovered that when he interviewed Swede Hansen, the co-pilot of Air Force One. Dr. Berkeley had blood on his sleeves. He somehow got involved in this thing, and I discovered that in the New York Times that weekend. Berkeley filed a report the next week that the reason he had blood on his sleeves was that he had reached into a garbage can at Parkland Hospital to get out a rose as a memento for Mrs. Kennedy. Okay. Wow. Okay, now there's a blood problem, I think, with Lyndon Johnson because he had been, I should say this, Sean found the reports that Lyndon Johnson was at the back of the airplane when the body comes on, and he actually had hands on the coffin. We have no witness to say he raised the coffin, but he's the hands-on. Nobody knows that Lyndon Johnson was hands-on Kennedy's coffin, but it's in an Air Force document or a publication, and there's witnesses that he's quote-unquote supervising. Well, later we learn out that Johnson ran into the bathroom of the Kennedy bedroom at the back of the plane, and he's hiding in there. And when the Kennedys get on board the plane, they don't know that Johnson's on their plane, and there's this delay. And Godfrey McHugh, the Air Force aide, says, "Why aren't we taking off?" And then the pilot says, "Well, I've been given orders not to take off." And McHugh is really upset. He's going back and forth in the front of the plane to the back. "What do you mean orders?" He says, "Well, Johnson's on this plane." He says, "No, he isn't. He's on his own airplane." And he says, "No, you tell me that 6-footer isn't Johnson." So McHugh and Kenny O'Donnell start looking for Johnson on Air Force One, and they can't find him. They finally figure out he must be in the president's bedroom, and he's not in there. So the only place left was the bathroom. And they open the door, and Johnson's hiding behind a sheet or something, or a curtain. And Johnson yells at him, "Get out of here, get out of here, close the door, The Secret Service told me to hide in here. There's a worldwide conspiracy. That's in Godfrey McHugh's report to the House Select Committee, but he said it on a Canadian radio interview, appropriately titled in 1976, "Thou Shalt Not Kill." This radio interview is this great exclusive interview, and I heard the interview, and it was sent to me by somebody. Anyway, that's what happened, and that's what McHugh says happened at the back of the plane. Now, what's important is that when Johnson emerged from the bathroom, he had a changed shirt. And Larry O'Brien notes in his memoir that he noticed that at the swearing-in, suddenly Johnson's wearing a changed shirt. So my joke was that maybe the Secret Service told him, listen, there's a worldwide conspiracy. We want you to go to the bathroom and change your shirt. Anyway, so that's what happened with Lyndon Johnson.
Okay.
So there's the problem with Lyndon Johnson and his shirt. There's the problem with Berkeley and his sleeves. There's the problem of Kellerman with the blood. But there's another problem. There's blood in the galley area. This is my discovery that, the body goes on, the coffin goes on the plane at 2:18. And if I'm correct, they got the body off the plane within minutes, because then Jackie came up and they all sat down next to a coffin, which unbeknownst to them was empty. Okay. Well, the judge arrives at 2:30 and the swearing in is at 2:38. We'll make a nice chart of this to show when we make a movie of this. Well, sometime before the swearing in at 2:38, Lyndon Johnson and Al Thomas, the Texas congressman who got Kennedy to make this trip and who Johnson winks at, during the swearing in.
Congressman winks at Johnson.
Yeah, Congressman winks at Johnson. They suddenly say they want vegetable soup. So now they want the galley open, and we want vegetable soup. And then
before the swearing in.
Yeah, before the swearing in, they want vegetable soup, and then they want doubles in vegetable soup. And so this is, and a researcher I told this to about a year ago, her name is Todd Vaughan. Todd says to me, "Are you sure they wanted vegetable soup before the swearing in?" I said, "Yes, it's in the notes of Marie Famer, Johnson's secretary." So I think what happened is that the way they covered the blood problem
in the galley
was to open a lot of vegetable soup and say some vegetable soup spilled or something, tomato-based vegetable soup.
So they must have felt that the blood trail in the galley was noticeable.
Yeah,
they were concerned about it.
I think they were concerned about it, and the most damning evidence about that occurs back at Andrews Air Force Base. Now, in Andrews Air Force Base, and maybe we just cut to that right now, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. Normally, when the Air Force One returns, the plane is immediately refilled, immediately refueled, because you always have to have Air Force One ready to go, especially on the day of the Kennedy assassination, when there's all this talk about, the Russians being involved in a nuclear war and all this stuff at the top of the government. So one of the people that Sean Fetter found was a fuel truck driver. And I'm trying to remember his name, Jimmy, I don't remember his name at this moment. And the fuel truck driver said that they didn't refuel Air Force One. It said he's in his fuel truck with all the jet fuel, and he's told to stay in the truck. And after Johnson, and the TV stops, and Johnson has made his little speech by Air Force One, "This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. I ask for your help and God's." And he gets on his helicopter and goes to the White House. This fellow, John Wetherill is his name, John Wetherill. He tells the story of that. He's sitting in his truck, and Air Force One is pulled into this hangar. And it's pulled all the way in, and only the tail sticks out, and the doors are closed. And he's told to stay in the truck. So an hour goes by, 2 hours goes by. He's in the truck all the way till the next morning.
Really? In the truck?
Yes. The plane was never refueled. He said he got out of the truck to go over and find out what's going on, and there's this big cleanup going on of Air Force One in this hangar. So the cleanup of Air Force One went on. He said, according to his information, AF-1 wasn't refueled until 3 o'clock on Saturday. Excuse me.
Morning or afternoon?
Saturday afternoon,
okay.
On November 23rd. Okay. So then this was so important that I arranged to go to Dallas, and I interviewed John on camera. We got the whole story on camera. So Air Force One, the cleanup of Air Force One at Andrews Air Force Base.
And when you say cleanup, you're not talking about cups and things.
No.
You're tell what's the cleanup that's being done?
I assumed that what John was talking about was cleanup. We're talking about hoses and cleanup equipment.
They were cleaning.
And they were cleaning AF-1, Air Force One.
They were cleaning the blood.
Well, I think he didn't get inside the hangar to know that much, but he said it was all very hush-hush, he said, and they were doing some kind of a plane cleaning. So I think that means that there was a problem. They just weren't tidying up. And cups and, coffee cups. I think we're talking about a cleanup having to do with the fact that there was a mess, not only in the galley, but in the forward luggage area where they brought the body. Now we get to the story of what happened next. Okay, so the plane takes off, and it arrives at Andrews Air Force Base. I usually say 6 o'clock, but actually the time when it actually stops, it's 6:04. And the question then became, well, how did they get the body out of the plane? And that's a whole other story. And I believe, based on the evidence, that the lights went out at Andrews Air Force Base, and the plane came in for a landing, and it turned onto a runway, well, it was taxiways.
Okay.
And that's when they got the body off the plane at the taxiway.
Okay.
But I don't want to dwell on that right now, except that they did not do it in front of the world's press.
Okay.
And up the runway at that taxiway, as far as I can see, was Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and Robert Kennedy. And why do I say that? Because, first of all, I have all kinds of pictures of Andrews that are now available, and film footage, and I've analyzed them. And it's clear that Robert McNamara is in charge of this whole thing. He's strutting around, and you can't get Air Force One to make a stop at an unannounced location. You can't just say, like hailing a cab on 3rd Avenue in New York. Somebody has to instruct the pilot. That order has to come over the radio. That when you get to Andrews, or the pilot or the control tower has to tell them you're going to go down this so many 100 feet, go on to taxiway such and such, and stop. Now, according to the Manchester book, and he conducted interviews with the pilot, he sees Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and I think he says Robert Kennedy standing right there. Well, that doesn't describe the stop that the public saw on TV. They're not there at that point.
So you think there was an up-the-runway stop, unbeknownst to the public?
There was a down, it's called actually the end of the runway stop.
Okay, end of the runway stop.
It comes in for landing, turns onto a taxiway, and stops there. And in the notes of the Secret Service, the actual landing time is 5:58, but it pulls into public view at 6:04. And the lights go out at Andrews, like you can hear Nancy Dickerson. I have these tapes. The lights have gone out at Andrews Air Force Base here. And then there's this puzzlement as to why the lights have gone out. And then suddenly, oh, and here's Air Force One. It's now arrived. Well, that's what happened. It was down the runway, and there was a stop. And I would also argue, further evidence of that is not only in the Manchester book, but that how did Robert Kennedy get on the plane? Because when the plane comes to a stop, there's no evidence. I don't see any evidence that Robert Kennedy ran up any ramp. It seems to me that if Robert Kennedy was at the public stop, all the reporters would have seen him. They would say, oh, there goes the Attorney General. He's running up the front steps to get on Air Force One. There's no such report. But when the rear door opens, there's Robert Kennedy holding Jackie's hand. How did he get on the plane? In fact, some of the people who knew Robbie Kennedy said, well, was he in Dallas or something? What's he doing on Air Force One? They didn't get it. But I think that's further evidence of the stop. But the best evidence of the stop is that the times. 5:58 is when the plane lands. 6:04 is when it's at the public stop. The lights went out. And I mean, a grade school person looking at the situation would say something happened. And then you go to the Manchester book, and he conducted these great interviews, which are all under seal. But he describes it in his book, that there's Bobby Kennedy, and I think he says McNamara, I'm not sure. But the bottom line is there's Bobby Kennedy and the Secretary of Defense or whatever. Well, there's no such event at the public stop. So, now, when the plane comes down the runway and it comes to the actual public stop, and I've looked at these frames, there's Robert McNamara, and next to him is an aide with a big, huge gym bag, the kind like I used to play squash. You have your squash rackets in. And I've concluded, and this is my own inference, that he had coveralls or something. And he had an aide de camp, who was with him, who carried this bag that had his coveralls. And I assume that at the stop, he personally supervised the removal of Kennedy's corpse.
Robert McNamara?
I think Robert McNamara must have done that, yes. Because how else did they get the body off the plane without anybody at Andrews seeing it? It had to be at that I keep calling it an up-the-runway stop, the end-of-runway drop-off.
Okay.
We've given it a name. Sean does call it ERDO, E-R-D-O, end-of-runway drop-off.
Okay.
And then we can get into the whole logic, the chronology of what happened next, because at the public stop, and as we'll see in the video, the announcers are saying, and there's a Navy ambulance that's pulled up to the side of the plane. Well, there's a whole other story going on, which we can get to in a minute. I want to get to the raised arm. But the other story is, how did they plan to get the body back into the coffin? What they plan to do is get that body get the coffin into a helicopter, one of those twin rotors, bring it to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, bring the body there, put the body back in the coffin, and then say, oops, wrong hospital, Mrs. Kennedy prefers Bethesda for the autopsy, and then fly over to Bethesda. Mm-hmm. This is all in the radio transmissions, and we can discuss that later. It's really important, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing, and this plan got, let me pause here. This plan got delayed, this plan got interrupted because a young Kennedy naval officer saw the Navy ambulance, and he said, why did you pull over to the side of Air Force One? You see, the Navy ambulance was not there for transportation of the coffin. It was there because it had a cardiologist in case Lyndon had a heart attack. And inside the ambulance was a guy named Dr. Welch. Well, his group was told, well, pull the Navy ambulance over there. Well, they screwed up the plans that were on the radio, which was to get that coffin into a helicopter and go over to Walter Reed. That's all in the radio transmissions, and we can talk about that. It's very dramatic stuff.
Let me just interrupt so we get clear about the purpose of this runway stop that occurred before the plane stopped in front of the cameras and the public.
It was to get the body off the plane.
Okay.
Get the body off that plane so they could then bring it somewhere. They had to get it into a body bag, and they had to get it, as a matter of fact, they ended up getting it over to Bethesda Naval Hospital, not Walter Reed. But this is important. In Marie Famer's notes, and she's the secretary to Lyndon Johnson, and she's making the notes on the plane, she says, 5:58 for the plane stop, body to Walter Reed. That was the plan.
That was the plan.
To train the body to Walter Reed, and the radio transmissions are filled with Colonel Chester Clifton saying, now here we want these 4 ramps. On the starboard side, we want a ramp for the First Lady. We're bringing her off on the starboard side. And we want a ramp on the port side. We want a lift on the port side for that heavy coffin. And we want a lift on the staircase on the port side so Lyndon can come down. All of the stuff is spelled out in the radio transmissions, which I published in Chapter 31 of Best Evidence. What I didn't have is what was all this about. And then I met with Chester Clifton that summer. The book was published, before it was published, and he granted me this interview in his office in Washington. We went over the transmissions, and it's a very dramatic interview. I have a tape of it. But the point is, he pretty much admitted that they could have done anything they wanted at the back of the plane because they could have had the body out of the coffin, and we talked about this. But anyway, he understood that there might be a body coffin problem here. The body was not in the coffin, and this was about to be published in my book. So he was reasonably forthcoming with me, but he didn't give away the store.
Before we continue with that part of the conversation, let us go back to let's go back to the body and luggage.
Yeah.
And they put JFK's body on a ledge.
I believe so, and I'll tell you why. Yes.
Yeah, I want to know what the evidence is that that's what happened.
Okay, so we're going to have to skip some of these logistics of the transportation of the body coffin reuniting, which didn't take place as planned. So now what end up happening at Bethesda Naval Hospital is the ambulance arrives at the front of the hospital, and it arrives at 6:55 carrying the coffin, Bobby Kennedy, and Jacqueline. And one of my rather big breakthroughs was the realization, and it was just one of these aha moments, that Bobby knows the coffin is empty. I mean, he's not being deceived. In the beginning, I thought he was deceived. He wasn't. He's with McNamara. They told him, listen, the body's your brother is in luggage.
So that casket that arrived with Robert Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy, that casket is empty.
Is empty. Is empty because the body had been taken out of the casket in Dallas, and it was somewhere else, and I now know, I'm pretty sure it's the forward luggage compartment.
Okay.
And the body arrives 20 minutes before the casket. And that's what Best Evidence has, all those chapters about the witnesses who know about that.
So they offload the body at this runway stop.
Yeah.
And it takes off to Bethesda in a helicopter.
Well, I think they used a chopper.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we think with a helicopter.
Yeah, I think so. And then from the helicopter it was transferred to a black hearse. And the black hearse arrived at the back of Bethesda Naval Hospital, as described by Dennis David, who was there when the was there when the black hearse arrived with federal agents, and the body was in a shipping casket, and inside, and Paul O'Connor opened the shipping casket, and inside was a body bag. So all of that is documented previously in Best Evidence. That part I know cold.
Okay.
Okay. So what's new? Well, what's new is that the person in charge of the military honor guard is named Philip Wheel, commander-in-chief of the Military District of Washington. The Army divides the country into districts, and MDW is the acronym for the Military District of Washington, which is the Washington, D.C. capital area. They handle security in the Capitol, including all state funerals.
Okay.
So they have an honor guard that met the plane. They don't know they're meeting an empty casket. Well, Wheel apparently found out that there's multiple caskets and there's some charade going on. And maybe he was briefed up to a point, but anyway, here's what happened over at Bethesda. He had an executive assistant named Richard Lipsey, young guy in his 20s. Lipsey arrives by helicopter at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and apparently Wheel is there, and Wheel goes over to Lipsey, takes his gun off, and straps his gun on Lipsey's waist, and he says, "You guard the body and don't you leave it." Now, Lipsey then goes to the back of the hospital where the body has arrived in this black hearse, and there's all kinds of security at the autopsy room, and they're not going to let anybody in there. But Lipsey has been told by General Wheel that he's going in that room
to guard that body.
Yeah, to guard it. There was no question about it. He was not fooling around. Lipsey didn't understand the seriousness of it. Get this, he had never been in combat. He had never seen a dead body before, like not even his grandmother at a funeral or something. That's the impression I get.
Okay.
And what happened is Lipsey goes in, and I learned all this stuff personally from Richard Lipsey in 1998. I had interviewed him on the phone in 1979. There's a document from the House Select Committee that didn't become available of their interview with Lipsey until about 1995. So I'm putting together all this stuff after the fact. But in 1998, I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where Richard Lipsey lives.
Okay.
And let me tell you, Richard Lipsey is not your ordinary guy. He's not worth $100,000 or $500,000. He's worth tens of millions of dollars because of some sporting goods store that his parents owned. And he married a woman who was the heir to one of the major clothing fortunes. And they live on this estate in this palatial residence with huge ponds and swans floating around in these ponds, and the interior of the house looks like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I mean, it's really amazing. Okay. But here's this tall guy who doesn't want to get involved, wouldn't let me use a tape recorder, wouldn't let me record anything. And I'm with a woman, a friend of mine named Marta Richards from Princeton, and that's why I went to Baton Rouge to see Marta. I wasn't going there to see Richard Lipsey. Okay. But this turned out to be very important. Okay. Marta, it turned out, knew Richard Lipsey's wife or a relative or something, and she said, why don't you try to see Lipsey while you're here? I had a great idea. So
you called him.
So she set this up.
Okay.
And I entered the house, the palatial residence of Richard.
So he did welcome you to the home?
Yes, he welcomes me.
And he knew who you, no, he didn't know who you were by then.
Oh, yes, no, he knew I wrote Best Evidence, but he made clear that he wasn't going to agree with any of my book. He makes this big thing of taking out Gerald Posner's book. Okay. So, this book was very good, case closed. Okay. Now, what am I going to do about this,
But yet he was willing to see you. But
yes, he was, with his wife, Susan Lipsey. Okay. So we're sitting in this thing that looks like this room that looks like the Metropolitan Museum, and everything's marble and beautiful and crystal. Okay. And we're sitting there, and this meeting goes on for about an hour or two. And Richard Lipsey still, in 1998, does not understand the subterfuge that took place in 1963.
All those years later.
That's right. He didn't understand it. And I had to explain to him, well, the ambulance that came in at the front had an empty casket. We went through this whole thing, and then he had these aha moments while he was speaking to me. And he made clear that, the body came in the rear, and the ambulance in the front just an ambulance. And I said, no, there was a casket in there. And that's when he realized that there was a decoy and all this other stuff, which he knew about, but he didn't have a complete understanding. But now we get to what he witnessed. Okay. So he tells me what the body looks like when he walked into the room. Now, the FBI had not yet arrived, and the body was a bloody mess. There was blood all over the body, blood and gook and gore, and one arm was raised, like a Heil Hitler salute, he tells me.
Really?
So, yes, really. And, I mean, he used the word Heil Hitler. It was Kennedy saluting from the grave. He never forgot it. And what was irritating about his whole thing is that on the one hand, he's relating to me this critically important information, which he did not understand. And by the way, I didn't understand why one arm would be raised either. So he didn't understand it, and I didn't understand it. But he was relating all this to me. And it was irritating because he wouldn't come to terms with that anything was wrong. So we were getting on with the interview, and he's telling me what happened next. That the autopsy doctor, Commander Humes, ordered the Navy to bring in a pail of water and Tide and a scrub brush. And so they're brushing down the body, they scrub all the blood off the body so they can do an autopsy.
Really?
Yeah. Now, what's wrong with this is, first of all, it's pretty gory. But second of all, what's wrong with this is it's not in the autopsy report. You know, nobody says in the autopsy report, the body arrived in this terrible condition, and I had to issue an order for a pail of water and a scrub brush and have 2 Navy guys scrub down the body. What the autopsy report starts is that the president was riding in a car in Dallas and there were 3 shots fired from this building or something like that. In other words, the autopsy report is all anti-Lee Harvey Oswald, all the official version, nothing about this stuff on the body, which is critically important because it makes the autopsy into a fraud. And then the commanding officer, I know from documents, told Commander Humes, the autopsy doctor, that your job here is to determine the cause of death. Now that's a strange statement to make. Look, here's the way life and death works when you draw a timeline. You go this way, and at this point you die. Up here is called antemortem, that's when you're alive, and over here is called postmortem. Now, when something like this happens, the autopsy doctor is not just to say, well, here's what happened at the dividing line. If something happened to the body after death, you better well believe that it's his job to report that too. But he's told by Commander Kenny, the Surgeon General of the Navy, also known as the Chief of the Bureau of Military Medicine, or Bureau of Navy Surgery, or whatever, that Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, BUMED, B-U-M-E-D is the Navy acronym, that he's just to determine the cause of death. It's to stop. On that timeline, he stops at the cause of death. Well, that's ridiculous in this case because the whole case turns on body alteration.
After death.
After death, right. All the events after death are critical in this case. If this was Law and Order or CSI, that's a ridiculous order. But anyway, so this guy, at least one person, is cleaning up the body and washing it down with Tide and a scrub brush. Can you imagine if the Warren Commission report's autopsy started with that paragraph? Now what about the arm? Commander Humes has to get up on the table, he tells me, and he sticks his knee in the armpit and forces down the arm. Now the question, I mean, to break what they called rigor mortis, because the arm was raised in rigor mortis at 20 to 25 degrees.
How in the world did that occur?
Right. How in the world did that occur? Now, a lot of times I'm pretty good at coming up with good hypotheses, but I didn't have any answer to that. And I felt a little bit weird about it because I studied math and physics, but I was weak on biology. I didn't study much. And I was wondering all I could focus on was the asymmetry of the situation. One arm goes up, and why not the other arm going? I mean, what's going on here? So now we got to go from July '98 when I had this interview to April '99, and I'd already gotten the drawings from Boeing. I had beautiful colored drawings of the luggage area and the Air Force jet and everything. And now enter Gina Peterman. Gina Peterman is this brilliant friend of mine. She was a former girlfriend from the 1990 period, and she's a Marxist, I think. You know, real left-wing. Her father was a famous Marxist and with what they call the baby brigader. He was connected with the people who went over to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Okay, well, anyway, I hadn't seen Gina in a while. We want to have breakfast on a Sunday morning, and I said, Gina, I want to show you these stuff. I want to question you. I want to pick your brain about what's going on here. She's brilliant, and she's a school teacher. People never forget Gina when they have a class with her. She knows math, she knows astronomy, she knows anthropology, she knows everything. She's just a storehouse of information, and she's a wonderful teacher. So we go to Dupar's restaurant in Los Angeles, and she's sitting to the right of me, and I'm over here, and she finds somebody else to talk to, you know, some other school teacher. And I said, look, I'm buying you pancakes. Will you give me some attention, please? I want to tell you this problem. So I show her the thing. Why is one arm raised, you know? And the guy's coming with the pancakes. And I mean, between the time I asked the question and the time Gina had the answer, it was like 30 seconds. She's really smart. She says, oh, silly goose, the arm didn't go up. He was lying on his belly and one arm flopped in the airplane when he was in flight. And I mean, I couldn't believe it. I said, how can I have been so stupid not to see this before? That he was on that ledge, which are clearly shown.
And his arm dropped.
And the question was, and the arm would drop
off the ledge.
Off the ledge if the plane banked or there was vibration. So then we get into this question of, well, where is the ledge and which way did the plane bank? Well, enter Sean Fetter. Sean interviewed Colonel Swindle, the pilot. He had interviewed him in 1993, I believe is the date. My files will have the correct date. And Swindle talked about when he took off from Dallas, you know, he banked sharply to the right because of security and everything, and they're worried about a communist plot or whatever. So he banks sharply to the right. Well, when you do the geometry, that would mean that Kennedy is facing, his head is to the rear, and he's on the ledge on the port side of the plane. And you can actually draw a diagram and show. So when the plane banked to the right, Kennedy's left arm fell off.
Ledge.
No one's in there, and it freezes in rigor mortis all the way to Washington, D.C. for 2.25 hours. So what you have there is the evidence of where Kennedy was on the airplane. And that was really blew my mind, because I think that's when I really knew I was able to connect the raised arm with John Wetherell's information about the plane cleaning. And I said, there's no question he was in the forward luggage area on the such and such shelf at the rear of the plane on the port side. And it was just such a great feeling to know that we knew that much about this.
That's stunning.
Yeah, isn't it? And a friend of mine, Kathy Gorey, who's another one of these brilliant women, and Kathy and Alan, a screenwriter, friends of mine, and she said, you know, they should go get luminol and do a luminol examination of that plane at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, because no matter how well they cleaned it, maybe there's some traces back there. But anyway, all these years have gone by, and I know it's because of the sequester, they no longer let people go on the plane right now, but we're in a period of a tight budget. But maybe someday they'll do luminol.
That's stunning evidence.
Yeah, it really was to me. I said, Kennedy was back there. Oh, and then I hired an artist, and we'll show this artist drawing. I said, I want a cutaway view. And he drew this great picture with the cutaway view showing Kennedy on this and below, and Johnson raising his hand with his hand on the Bible, taking the oath as President of the United States. I mean, this thing is right out of Shakespeare. It has very little to do with the Warren Report.
David, speaking of the oath of office, that even grade school kids know that upon the death of the president, the vice president immediately becomes president.
Right.
Why do you think LBJ took the time, given this national crisis, to have Judge Sarah Hughes come to the airplane for the official swearing in that would not have needed to take place?
Yeah.
What's behind that?
Well, what's behind that is a delay the takeoff from Dallas. That's exactly what's behind it, because when Johnson tells the Kennedy party, well, they're amazed that the flight is being delayed. Why not? Why can't we take off right now? Okay, so you're on our airplane, but let's go. And he said, no, Bobby told me to be sworn in first. And he repeated that again and again and again. And one of the things that happened that evening was that different Kennedy aides would tell Bobby, you know, Johnson said that you told him to delay the flight for swearing in. He said, that's ridiculous. And anyway, it's a clear matter of history now that Bobby Kennedy says basically that that's not true, so that Lyndon Johnson lied. And so that's just a fact.
And the purpose of the delaying the plane leaving.
Right. Was to give time so that something could be done to the body.
So that's the time they used. That's the time right there. So while he's taking the oath of office in the plane, below in luggage, President Kennedy's body, the head, is being bludgeoned.
I believe so. Yep.
That's the time frame they used.
Yeah,
that's the reason for the delay of takeoff.
That's the reason for the delay of takeoff. The time they got the body on the plane at 2:18, the swearing in is at 2:38. I wouldn't be surprised if they were done by 2:38. But anyway, they didn't take off till 2:47. So you have that time. I think it's 29 minutes from 2:18 to 2:47 or something. That's your time period. And it's after the swearing in that Johnson turns around and Congressman Thomas, it gives him this broad wink, and Stoughton's photograph captures that wink. I was the one that discovered the wink photograph.
And published it for the first time.
Right. And I called up Stoughton about it. You know, when I found it, first of all, I found it, I mean, in a way by accident. My birthday was coming up, and I said, I want to give myself a birthday present. I ordered all the swearing-in photographs from the LBJ library. There's about 15 or whatever they are. I want to get them all and see who was upstairs in the plane and who was not. So the pictures come in, and they had published these pictures once before in Time magazine back in 1967 when Manchester's book was published, because Manchester said that certain Kennedy aide, Kenny O'Donnell, wasn't there, and it turns out the picture shows that he was there. Okay, so that was a big news story. So now I get out my magnifying glass and I'm looking, and then there's one more picture that was in the official Time magazine publication. And there's this congressman winking at Johnson. This big wink,
That's
you know.
Totally inappropriate.
Totally inappropriate to say the thing, but the thing I didn't know at the time was that the major role that Congressman Thomas played in getting Kennedy to make the trip to Texas, which we'll get to in a minute, telling him his whole story about I've got cancer and you got to come here to my tent.
Let's talk about that a bit.
Okay.
Because people think that the reason JFK went to Texas was to heal a rift in the Democratic Party. That's sort of the story.
Right.
So tell me about Al Thomas and what his role was.
Okay, first of all, the rift in the Democratic Party, I am sure, was promoted by Johnson. It's not a story. He took actions to create a riff.
To create a riff.
Create a riff. And then they say, well, you got to come here and heal the riff. Okay. But the real big reason, the really big reason was not just that Johnson kept nagging Kennedy to come to Dallas for political reasons, and you got to help because the '64 election's coming up, you know, and Goldwater is going to be the opposition. But in addition, his buddy Al Thomas, who was a very powerful congressman, he controlled like 10% of the United States budget, including the whole NASA space program.
Oh. Which was near and dear to JFK's heart.
Very near and dear to JFK's heart. And he was an important Texas liberal. So he's an important person on one of the major committees to get the program through. So suddenly, in April 1963, Thomas announces he's resigning. And he then goes to President Kennedy and says, I have cancer, and I'm resigning. And there's this, it's in the Washington newspapers, and Kennedy is kind of like, don't resign, we need you to get the program through. He said, well, I'm having this testimonial dinner in my honor on November 21st, 1963 in Houston, and I'd be mighty obliged if you'd come to Houston. So the reason Kennedy went to Texas, and that's the original reason, was to come to Houston to the Al Thomas dinner. But that's the anchor for the trip. Okay. And then you start adding on things like bells and whistles on a Christmas tree, you know, and then they add all these other cities, and there's motorcades in every city.
Austin, Fort Worth, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio.
San Antonio. And the order is San Antonio, Houston for the dinner, the next morning Fort Worth. And there's a lot of finagling, and then comes Dallas and Austin. And there's a lot of finagling going on because originally San Antonio was on a different day. They had to really do a lot of playing around with the schedule to make it so that that the motorcade would leave from the airport. And they had to make, San Antonio was on Friday, it had to be shifted to Thursday. There's a lot of stuff going on, but Thomas was centrally involved in getting Kennedy to make this trip to Texas. So there he is winking at Lyndon Johnson. And you have to know the whole cancer story. By the way, Thomas's cancer went into remission. Kennedy's dead from the bullets, but Thomas lived for a few more years.
And did he resign from Congress, or did that
No,
not happen?
he died. He died in 1967 or something. But another thing that happened is in the fall of '63, when Kennedy balked about the trip, there was some problem about Kennedy not really deciding to make this Texas trip. Thomas then took a meat axe to the space program. And basically, the message was, if you don't come to Houston, you're not going to the moon.
Wow.
And that's the deal.
Wow.
If you don't come to Houston, you're not going to the moon. So they
used that leverage over JFK to get him down to Dallas.
To Texas. And of course, from Texas, I mean, Thomas doesn't control the Dallas stuff. That's dealing with a different cast of characters. And then you get into other, but it's basically an Al Thomas trip. Yes. And that was not brought out sufficiently before the Warren Commission.
So let's talk about one of the central characters of this whole assassination, and that's Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right.
And your upcoming book, Final Charade, is a lot about him.
Yes.
And so one of my questions, the big question is why the title Charade? But maybe you want to talk about his background first?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So now we're at different places on my own timeline. Okay. When Best Evidence was completed and published in 1981, then came this whole question of, well, what am I going to do next? And then it was published again in '82, but I really was lost. I didn't know. It was a very peculiar time for me. I had a nice check coming in from Macmillan because it was on the bestseller list and the Book of the Month Club, but I didn't know who I was. I mean, I had done this thing in life that started when I was 27 or whatever it was, and now it was completed. And now I was 40, whatever, 1 or 2, whatever. Anyway, and I didn't know what I wanted to do next. And should I go to law school? Should I pick up? And I've been in this time tunnel. And people noticed it. I mean, at my Cornell reunion, you know, people talked about, well, you know, he's been working on this for 15 years. And I didn't know what to do next. And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Macmillan wanted me to write another book on the Kennedy assassination, which is really not what I wanted to do. I wanted to go skiing. I wanted to take ski lessons, which I did. And then we signed a contract to do a sequel. Okay. So then the question became, well, what am I going to do with the sequel? And I wanted to talk about John Connolly because he was also wounded. Well, okay. Then what next? And I realized, well, maybe my sequel should have a chapter on Oswald. And that's what it was going to be, a chapter on Oswald. And I thought
in a bigger book.
Yeah, in a bigger book. This is going to be easy. In a way, I thought, after all, the Warren Commission report is all about Lee Harvey Oswald. So I'll just be able to synopsize.
Easy.
And, you know, and talk about this guy who was framed because of this device of body alteration. Little did I know. So I start tackling this problem. I think we're talking about the year 1982.
Okay.
And you start talking about Oswald and you get into this trip to Russia. Now, here are the facts. Oswald was born in 1939. He was born, I'm 3 weeks older than Oswald, so I went through the same period he did in the same basic parallel time frame. I was born on September 20th, 39. He was born on October 18th. So it was easy for me to relate to him, very easy, because we're going through life in parallel paths chronologically. Now, in 1959, so he goes, on his 17th birthday in 1956, he joins the Marines. And then he gets out of the Marines on 9/11, 1959, and then makes a beeline for Russia. And a lot of people thought he was an agent, and I was sympathetic to that and everything, the idea that he...
An agent for
the CIA or something.
Okay.
But the question is about this defection. It's easy to be glib about this, but you know, the guy goes over there and he arrives in Moscow on October 16th, 1959. Well, he had a
So the height of the Cold War.
The height of the Cold War.
This Marine goes over to the Soviet Union.
Right. And then what happens is, on October, he gets a 6-day visa. Everybody got a 6-day visa. That's all you got. Well, he apparently, says he has radar secrets or whatever. He wants to. He says that he has a. He says that he wants to live in the Soviet Union for the rest of his life. That he's a communist and a Marxist, and that's where he wants to stay for the rest of his life. And basically, what happens on the 3rd or 4th day, they say, "We're not interested. Yankee, go home in your secrets," because he was offering certain secrets.
Secrets that.
Well, we don't know. They just called radar secret.
Okay.
I mean, it was in the telegraphic traffic about this defection between the State Department and the Moscow embassy is that, it was offered the Soviets certain radar information.
Okay.
Anyway, so they said no, and he cut his wrist, and he attempted suicide. Well, when a person attempts suicide and says they're a communist and want to live there for the rest of your life, one of the things you think is, well, he must really be a Marxist. I mean, this guy's really a serious communist who want to live in the Soviet Union for the rest of his life and attempt suicide if he can't get in.
Right.
So they changed their mind, by the way, and let him stay. So in writing about this, I had this problem, and what am I going to say? Is he a real communist or what? What's going on here? And I ran up against this problem like right away. What if I could write about Oswald, what am I going to say about the suicide? So I start taking a closer look at this suicide thing. And I get the Soviet medical records. They're in the 26 volumes, and I find that it's a shallow cut. And I said, my God, this is like a fake suicide.
Okay.
So why is it a fake suicide? What's he doing, That was confusing, but it was the beginning of some insights about Oswald. I said, wow. Then within a week or two of that, I found this letter that he wrote his brother a couple of months before he left for the Soviet Union. And he said, I now know what I want to be and how I'm going to be it, and I guess that's what's important in life. And this is mid-June 1959. And I said, wow, Oswald knew what he wanted to be in 1959. That's great. When he was, whatever it was when he was in 1959, I said, that's great, he's 19 years old. I still don't know what I want to be, and I've written this book, and I'm not sure what I want to be when I grow up. This guy knows what he wants to be. What does he want to be?
Yeah.
And what's the connection between what he wants to be and the suicide statement, and the suicide attempt? I wasn't really sure at all. So I sent, in Los Angeles were all my files. I was living in New Jersey, but my files were in Los Angeles because I had come to New Jersey in connection with attempting to get a publisher, and then stayed for 3 years to finish the book and living in my parents' home. So I asked my dear friend, the late Bernie Kenton, to go to my apartment in Los Angeles and to get this big box of files on Oswald, which I set aside when I was writing Best Evidence. I called it Okron. It was in a big, one of those storage boxes. And I said, get me the Okron box and send it. There's probably a lot of stuff in there. I want to see what I have. So he sends it by, some like FedEx or something with the cheaper way. We finally get the box. I get it up to my apartment in New Jersey. I open it. And I'm going through notes I made on Texas microfilms in 1969, the summer of '69, when I was reviewing Texas microfilms for the purpose of finding out why Kennedy made the trip to Texas. But you'd come across all kinds of other stuff about Oswald, and I put it in an Oswald file. Well, there was this article on October 31st, 1959, when Oswald was in Russia, an interview with his brother, that Lee Oswald went to Russia to write a book. And that's what the thing. Did Fort Worther go to Russia to write book? I can read it off the notes in here. If you want to pause, maybe we should pause for a minute, and I'll read what I wrote, what the actual headline.
Or just keep going.
Okay. So, well, it's in that. It's in the. It's in that email I sent you last night.
Okay.
A second. Hold it. Hold it. Here it is. I'll read it. I typed it out because I knew this was going to be important. So here it is. So it's the Fort Worth Press. October 31st, 59. What's just happened is that Lee Oswald, he had been told, he couldn't stay. He made the suicide attempt. He was in the hospital for 10 days. They quickly found out that he wasn't a psycho. And he said he was sorry he did it, but he wanted to remain in Russia, get their attention, blah, blah, blah. So they said, okay, finally they said, okay, we're going to be interviewing you again, and it looked clear that he was going to be allowed to stay. Well, that made the news.
So his fake suicide attempt served the purpose that he was after, which allowed him to stay in the Soviet Union.
That's correct.
So for his purposes, it worked.
It worked. And then what happened is he's now been told basically that things are going your way, though it wasn't final. And on October 31st, 2 days after he got out of the hospital, he marches into the American embassy, throws his passport down. This is 2 weeks after he arrived in Russia. He says, I'm defecting and I want to stay here for the rest of my life, and I hate the United States and I hate capitalism, blah, blah, blah. And this makes the news because Richard Snyder, the counsel, briefs the press about this peculiar Marine who did this. And this makes the news. It's on the wire services, and they interview Robert Oswald, and this appears in the tiny newspaper called the Fort Worth Press, not the Dallas Morning News. And the headline was, Fort Worther may become Russian so he can write about experience. And on the inside page it goes, Fort Worth man to become red to write a book? By Kent Biffle. And here's the text. Does a Fort Worth ex-Marine want to become a Russian so he can write a book about it? The question was raised when the brother of Lee Harvey Oswald, blah, blah, blah. I said, oh my God, that's what he wants to be.
That's what he wants to be.
He wants to be a writer. He wants to be a writer like me. I'm a writer. Guess what? This guy's a writer. He's like, wow. So I'm saying, wasn't there a manuscript of the Warren Commission evidence? Well, there sure was. Didn't he go to a steno when he got back from Russia and spend 3 days with a steno? He sure did. So
he had a manuscript.
He had a manuscript. I was trying to study. I said, God, nobody's ever looked at the case this way. This guy's a writer. So that's how this whole thing starts with me and the writer business. So now, and I'm saying spelling is so bad because he has dyslexia. He's dyslexic. So he looks foolish when he writes. But that's, if you clean up his manuscript, and I started doing that. Here I got my word. This is when computers first came out. I had a Wang, what they call a Wang writer. So I'm typing away, I'm typing up the manuscript. And my nice type. And it reads very nicely. I'm saying, God, this guy's a writer. Look how well he uses the English language. Look at this, look at that. And at the time I met a woman in New Jersey, and her husband, they had a dyslexic son. Her name was Pat Dashosh, D-A-S-H-O-S-H. And I was telling her about all this, and she was excited about it. She was helping with the manuscript, and I met Jack, her husband, and we had many a conversation about Oswald the writer. And I said, this is really going to be great. Oswald's a writer. I'm going to publish his manuscript, and I'm going to prove that he's not the assassin. Now, this is great. This is 1984, October. And what I'm about to tell you, now here we are in 2013. Now, since I developed all the evidence about Oswald being a writer, and it's not just me looking at a manuscript, I interviewed people who know him and a lot of other stuff about him being a writer, including a reporter who wanted to co-author with him. Since I have a whole case about Oswald being a writer, why didn't I publish it yet? Well, the reason is it has to do with my own opinion about the way publicity works in this country. And with the advent of the internet, I started to realize that people are going to say, David Lifton discovered this murderer, Oswald's a writer. So what? He spent all these years working on the fact that he's a writer. It's a footnote to history. Who cares? He still murdered President Kennedy.
Right.
So that's why I realized I'd better get more than he's just a writer. Because if you, see, I'll tell you, when this is published, the writers and reporters are going to get mad. They're going to say, they're going to have the same identification with Oswald I hope that I had. But they got to have more evidence. You got to have the DOA stuff. You have to know the body was altered to make him look like a murderer. You can't just say hey, he's a writer, therefore he's innocent. I mean, in court, nobody goes into court and says, my client's innocent. Why? Well, because he's a writer. I mean, there's writers that are murderers. So you got to be careful about that. Now, that's not the only thing that happened in October '84. And this is the other big breakthrough, which led to this huge delay in publishing all this stuff and led to the concept of final charade. And I'll tell you what that is now. So while I'm going forward on this track one of the writer and speaking to Pat Dashosh and everything, I'm getting into this whole business about Oswald being an agent, or trying to get into it. And I'm thinking, how could Oswald be an agent if he was so afraid of coming back to the United States since he was worried about being prosecuted? What's that all about? If you're an agent, you're not worried about being prosecuted because anything you did wrong, you did for the agency, right?
Exactly.
So I said, I'd better look into this business of him being afraid of being prosecuted. Where does that come up? Well, it comes up, it turns out, I said, he wrote his brother some letters, and he wrote his mother some letters, and he wrote the State Department. I'd better get this stuff together and really see what he said about this fear of prosecution. Well, it's easier said than done when I was in New Jersey. Today, I mean, there's Kinkos everywhere. In 1984, I don't know what they had there, but I was living in this high-rise apartment in North Bergen, New Jersey, and it wasn't that easy. There was no university nearby. Anyway, I gathered my volumes, went to a Xerox machine somewhere or other, and Xeroxed all the letters and put them in chronological order. And I went to my favorite place to do my thinking then, which was one of those diners where I would probably eat too much. And I'm going through all these letters, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm reading these letters about his fear of prosecution. And I'm saying to myself, God, these letters read weirdly. It's like he's not writing to his brother. He's writing to a third party.
And the letters were addressed to his brother?
Yeah, oh yeah.
And to his mother as well?
In Fort Worth.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I got to think, and I said to myself, wasn't there a CIA program about intercepting the mail, where they had mail intercept, a secret mail intercept program that at Idlewild Airport, which became JFK Airport, and wasn't that the subject of some government hearings? So at that time, I called up this guy at Berkeley, who was a friend of mine. He's now passed on, named Robert Ramphtel. And I think I shared some of this. I said, we got to get the church committee hearings and get this stuff on this mail intercept program. Well, it wasn't too long before I had the transcripts of the church committee hearings, okay? And it's called HT Lingual, HT-Lingual.
That's the name that the CIA had given this program?
It's run by James Angleton.
A mail intercept program for mail coming into this country that they
from,
would be interested in looking at.
Right.
So opening it up, illegal.
It was the CIA having a special relationship with the postal inspectors, and they have a building over at LaGuardia or Idlewild Airport. So the mail comes in, it's dragged off the plane, and here's the way they do it. They had a watch list. And if you're on the watch list, you had your mail intercepted. Now, we're talking about a different America. In 1959, there were 300 people on the watch list, and Lee Harvey Oswald was one of them.
Oh, really?
Okay. Guess what? Today, you're talking about tens of thousands of people on the watch list. You're talking about 9/11. You're talking about terrorism. You're talking about watch lists and computers. And I mean, it's a big deal today. But then 300
people on the watch list.
About 300.
And he was one.
And he was one of them. So you got these guys pawing through the mail bags, right?
Looking for letters.
Wearing these green visors. Oh, there's an Oswald letter. They pull it out. They photograph it, or they send it to they pull it out. In fact, they were joking. There's a joke about this. They had these steam kettles, like you make coffee or tea in, and they had to
put the envelope over the steam.
Get the thing moist, get it open, photograph it, put it back in the mail, and then the photo record goes to the counterintelligence division of the CIA, run by the legendary James Angleton. So now I said, I'm reading the letters and I'm saying, wow, I'm looking at the letters to Robert Oswald and his mother differently than I've ever. I didn't even read them before. In 1984, when I was reading the letters about the fear of prosecution, I had this insight.
Whose fear of prosecution?
Oswald's fear of prosecution. Okay. Reading those letters, I started for the first time to realize that the letters were written to someone else. I mean, there's somebody else. He's not just writing to his mother and his brother. Main thing was to his brother. And that led me to the thing of, well, who could he be writing to? And that led to the realization that the third party, it's like a party line, the third person on the line is the CIA, the counterintelligence division. And I don't want to be so abstract about it. It's James Angleton who heads this CIA. HT Lingual was James Angleton's baby. Okay, just like today they're getting into this huge discussion of whether you have the right to tap and collect all this information about cyber communications. Right. It was James Angleton's bright idea, as I recall, the Soviet Russia division's bright idea. Hey, we can collect all the mail coming in from Russia or from Europe, for that matter. You can just set up these systems with a watch list. And it's more primitive, but that's what they did.
But it was effective.
Very effective. So when you start reading these letters, so then I said, well, okay, what do these letters tell me? I started viewing the letters in a different way. Can I extract information from the letters as to what he's communicating about? Is there something in here that will prove to me that he's really doing what I'm thinking is going on here? It's one thing to say, I suspect this from the tone. It's another thing to actually have evidence. So I'm looking at the letters and I'm arranging them in chronological order. And here's the deal. 3 letters are written in 1959. November 8th, November 26th, and there's one in mid-December. Here's what happens on November 8th. On November 8th, it's a very angry letter. Very angry because he's saying, I will never come home. I'm staying in the Soviet Union, and I have no intention of leaving here, and I'm staying here for the rest of my life. Now, that's what he says on November 8th. Then comes November 26th. There's another letter, and this one says, Dear Robert, or something. I mean, we could when we produce this movie, we can talk about what these letters actually say. That's a 10-page letter, and it's filled with all kinds of vituperation against the United States and all kinds of interesting stuff. And then there's the third letter is just maybe 1 page. And it says, I'm staying in the Soviet Union here. Please don't ever attempt to contact me again. I want to be alone. I don't want to have any further contact with my family. You could appreciate that. And I said to myself, my God, this guy's going out in the cold. I mean, he's breaking with the CIA in the field if this is what's going on. And then, of course, you go to the 61 letters, and he starts writing to the CIA, as I recall, I just slipped. He starts writing to his brother on May 2nd, 1961, 2 days after he marries Marina Oswald. And he goes on from May 2nd, 61, right through to the week or two before he gets on the boat and leaves Russia to come home. So you go 1961 all the way through 62. Okay. Well, the 59 letters intrigue me because they're so angry. And so I'm starting to look at them, and I'm looking for some evidence, because I finally said to myself, I can't figure this out, what he's saying, because well, I didn't have the concept at the time that he's writing in a metaphoric code. I just knew he was angry. But then in the middle of the November 26th letter, there's this passage, and it goes, "You say you have not renounced me. Good, I am glad. But let me tell you on what terms I want this arrangement." And I say, wow, because what arrangement? His brother is a milkman. He delivers milk for Borden's or something in Fort Worth. He doesn't have any arrangement with his brother.
Right.
I mean, what is he talking about? I'll tell you on what terms I want this arrangement. There's an argument going on between him and someone in Washington, and he's like redefining their contract and saying, I'll tell you on what terms I want this, but let me tell you on what terms I want this arrangement. So that convinced me that Lee Oswald had a mission. And this was a way of communicating back channel. I learned what the word back channel means. And the question became, what else can I learn from these letters? And there was lots of little things scattered in the letters, which I can't do by memory right now when I'm camera. But there was lots of little interesting things. One of them was that certain passages would be underlined. Others would not be underlined. Years later, I figured out what that was all about. That he had what I call, the underlining meant it was a not signal, N-O-T. So if you say, I hate you, and you underline it, it means I love you. And you say, I'm not ever coming home, and you underline it, it means I will be coming home someday. In other words, the underlining business with it was a syntactical not signal, N-O-T signal. That came years later. The question was, what did these letters mean, and what could I learn from them? So I did my very best, and I realized he's communicating with someone in Washington. And also, it was not lost on me that the letters to his mother, one of the letters said, Mother has been real good to me. She sent me some packages. Well, Mother was Angleton's code name. So I'm saying, this guy's in touch with Angleton. That's what my feeling was. So that's how I felt about the letters. And there's a lot more to be said about the letters. I'd have to construct and consult my notes. But there were a lot of, I did so much time in highlighting the letters, looking at every single word, every phrase, trying to figure out where he's tucking away some hidden meaning. But my conclusion was that, yes, he's communicating back channel with someone in Washington, and since Angleton is running the program, my God, this is evidence that he's Angleton's agent, or he's doing. And the question was, what was the mission, and what are these letters all about? And is it just simply keeping track of what he's doing? And then he's out of touch. There's this dark period between when he says, "Leave me alone, I'm going to be on my own." That's December 1959 till he resumes communication on early May 1961. So that was a thing. Now. I'm not doing justice, unfortunately, in this conversation to the plethora of data that was tucked away in the letters, but I felt that the letters were once a month reports. Oh, I also noticed that he'd start the letters by saying, "Well, what should we talk about? The weather, perhaps?" And I realized that he was given some kind of a structure. I think that to open a letter with a sentence about the weather, I think Angleton was paranoid or something, and he had to constantly reassure himself that the person with whom he's communicating is really Lee Oswald. So they had some prearranged code, like talk about the weather in the first sentence or something like that.
And so, David, in order for Oswald to communicate with Angleton, they would have had to have some agreed upon language that each of them knew what that language meant in code. For example, you were talking about the underlined words.
Correct.
They would have had to have some understanding of what those words meant with each other.
Yeah, and there's a word for that, a term of art that the dictionary, yes. They have to have a cyber dictionary, even if it only contained 25 words or 50 words, so they could communicate back and forth. Not back and forth, but well, he could communicate.
At least one way.
Yeah, and when he gets to one of the big arguments in the November 26th letter, and he's arguing about whether he's going to come home or not, he says, he talks about some word, he says, look that up in the dictionary. And I realized, the dictionary, Oswald was great at double meetings. He's talking about the cyber dictionary the two guys had. So he's trained. He had to have training to use HT lingual as a back channel. And to write a sentence like, you say if you're not renounced me, good, I'm glad, but let me tell you in what terms I want this arrangement means that he had been trained to write sentences. In other words, what happened was at some point in that letter, he didn't have any code words. We had to write in plain text, plain English. And so we burst into plain English. I decoded that letter completely subsequently once I learned he was using a metaphoric code. Now let me tell you what happened. Years go by, and I'm jumping ahead now. It happened to be 9/11/1999. I made these discoveries basically in October, November 1984, saying go forward 15 years. And a friend of mine at the time, her name was Laren Safer. She was my girlfriend, and she said to me one day, she listened to everything I had to say about this. She said, "How did Oswald signal that he was on this mission? How did he report back about his mission, and that it hadn't worked out, and that's why he was not coming home? He was going to stay to write his book or something like that." And I said, "I don't know. Maybe he put a flower pot out on the ledge." I mean, I really was thinking of Watergate, and I said, "I just don't know." But I said, I can't understand how he did it because the letters are so short. But I said, well, wait a minute, that November 26th letter was 10 pages. And I remember that morning I said, oh my God, I'm going to have to take another look at that 10-page letter. And we had just had breakfast, and I said, I'll see you later. And I went to my office, and I pulled the letter, and now I looked at the letter in a completely different way because I, by that time, knew, now we've skipped over this, I by that time knew what the mission was. And the mission had to do with radar. And it had to do with radar disinformation, giving the Soviets bogus radar secrets. Now, that was a whole other track we could talk about, and maybe we should briefly. But I understood the mission, so I said, well, how did he communicate that the mission failed? So this is 9/11/1999. I went up to my office, grabbed the file, went out to where I can have a cup of coffee in an outdoor area at UCLA, and I started going over this letter, sentence by sentence, looking for some code word that would indicate that the mission failed. And by God, if it wasn't on the second page of the letter, right at the top, and he talks about economics. The whole letter is disguised as an argument about Marxism and economics and everything. And then on the top of the second page, he says, in this country, and he goes on and on about it, and he says, science is neglected. And I said, my God, the code word for the radar mission is science. And the fact that they're not interested is science is neglected. And I said, how clever of Oswald. Now, years later, I said to myself, if something goes wrong, maybe they told him to free use that phrase, that he didn't invent it himself. But anyway, science is neglected. It was the metaphoric code. And then other sentences like, I only came here to find freedom. I think freedom was the code word for his book project. In other words, they knew when he went to the Soviet Union, he didn't say to them, I'll do your mission, and then keep them in the dark that he had a literary agenda. No. Whoever was the handler said, look, I want to go over there to write a book. If you want to help me out, give me some money, get me over there, fine. But I have my book to write. So they set up a code system. He could report back and see how he's doing. And I think freedom was the word for the book project. There's a whole bunch of them. I have vocabulary worked out. And when I write my chapter on this, I'll put down the vocabulary and what it was. It's not that complicated, but science is the radar program. Freedom, I think, was the book project, and other things like that. So that's what happened. And I became convinced from this that these letters, and they're decoding, they're deciphering, are the cryptographic evidence that Oswald was an agent, a low-level agent, at an intelligence assignment when he went to the Soviet Union. It's marvelous evidence because it's documentary in nature, and it's wonderful evidence. There it is. It's written out. And I defy anyone to come up with an explanation for why he would write, you say you have not renounced me.
Let me tell you under which conditions.
Let me tell you what terms I want this arrangement. And what is he talking about? There's your evidence. I mean, it's great evidence.
So he's sent over to the Soviet Union by the CIA on a mission to provide to the Soviets false radar information.
Yeah, now the way I came up with that was the answer is yes. First of all, he's offering them radar secrets. Now, it wasn't obvious in the beginning at all what he's offering and what was going on here, because this is called a dangle. When you dangle information in front of you and see if they'll bite, and you get feedback based on their reaction is how much they know about something. I didn't understand. I didn't have the evidence that he was dangling. It came in two different times in 2 different years. One was in 1994, when I think the number 2 man in the CIA program, and I think his name was Ben Rich, published his memoir. He's since passed away, called Skunk Works. And he was on 60 Minutes, and my friend, the late Robert Chapman, called me up and said, you got to get this program, you got to watch it, get this book, Skunk Works. I ran to what was then Crown Books, grabbed Skunk Works, and by God, within an hour, I have this really important information that the CIA, Ben Rich, had this radar disinformation program, and they were producing false radar manuals to deceive the Soviets about the capabilities of the U-2 and then slipping them to the Soviet military somehow. And I said, oh, that's probably what Oswald's mission is all about. And I found some supporting evidence for that. That was 1994, November. And I said, wow, bingo. I mean, I was sure. But also what was important was that Norman Mailer's book was published in April 95. And he interviewed at length the Soviet, the KGB, the Intourist lady who was his guide. And I forget her name right now. Anyway, in that chapter 1, she talked about what happened on each day when he first arrived. And on the second day, he said that he had these special secrets he was willing to give if they let him stay. So there was the evidence of the dangle. Nothing like that appears in the Warren Report. They didn't have it. Norman Mailer had it. He didn't appreciate what it meant. The guy was on a dangle mission. So then the question became, okay, if he's dangling, which he was, according to the Mailer interview of, what's her name? Rima Shirokova. If he was dangling, what was the whole purpose of this? I mean, exactly what was the dangle about? Well, it was about a black box, I think, that they had to deflect Soviet radar. And if he gave them false information about the black box, and they were trying to decode the signals, they would think the plane is over here, but it's really over there, and that kind of thing. Now, before I forget this, one of the great ironies of this is that Oswald actually said, when he was coming home 2 years later, he told somebody at on the incoming to New York City, when he was interviewed, that he was a radar expert, okay? Which is very funny, because then that person wrote somebody at HEW, well, we'll have no trouble assisting Oswald with employment because he's a radar expert, which is very amusing.
Yes,
You'll have no trouble getting him a job in the economy.
Right.
So that was that. Now, there was something else I was about to say about the radar. Oh, I know what it was. When did this whole business with the radar start? Well, he got shifted to, he joined the Marines on his 17th birthday, October 20, actually a few days later, a week later. He joined on October 24th, 1956. An ordinary Marine, he checked the box to be a grease monkey, lubricate planes. I mean, look, a guy dropped out after the 9th grade in school. So what the heck's going on with this business of radar? Well, Larry Happenan, researcher Larry Happenan, my friend, he discovered in 2002 that Oswald was switched to radar 4 months later. And he found the document to show that he was first a grease monkey, and then his military occupational specialty, which is called in the military MOS, was switched to radar in the 3rd week of March 1957, which is a great story because it showed that this started really early. And the question became, how did it start so early? What did they give Oswald a test or something? How did this happen? I don't think it's easy to explain how I came up with the answer, but we had to go forward many years. But the fact is that when Oswald joined the Marines, he was involved in his own outreach because he already knew he wanted to be a writer, and he's going to go to the Soviet Union when he got out of the Marines, and now he was looking to pick up like an intelligence assignment if he could get one. And so he must have written a letter or something, I think, and it went over to the CIA, and somebody said, hey, Alan, or hey, Jim Angleton, look at this kid. He's 17 years old, and he wants to go there to write a book when he gets out. Maybe he's looking for an assignment. Maybe we can do something. I think something like that happened. Anyway, within 3 or 4 months of joining the Marines, he was switched to radar. Now, he was switched to radar. He was sent to Atsugi Naval Air Station by the fall of 1957. And what's interesting about it is that President Eisenhower suspended the radar flights in March '58. And the result was there was nothing to do dangling about. And that lasted for over a year. When the radar flights resumed, Oswald suddenly was, I think, was given this assignment. He got this early discharge, and he left on 9/11.
So this excursion to the Soviet Union was a really interesting hybrid blend of his two interests. He wanted to be a writer, and then the mission that he had as an agent,
intelligence assignment, yeah,
an intelligence assignment, served the purpose of getting him
of giving him assistance.
So he has an opportunity to write about the story.
Well, yeah, he's an opportunity, but never about the radar assignment.
Right.
And by going to his manuscript, you can see that he's posing as a defector, a guy who believed in communism, went over there and found it wasn't what it was cracked up to be, came back, and here he's writing his book about it.
Okay.
But he never talks about. In other words, he censors himself,
right.
So his own story is censored, so he never reveals the CIA connection.
Okay.
Okay. So now he comes. He's so where were we? So
the dangle wasn't successful.
Yeah. Okay. So that
and he wanted to stay over there.
Stay there, right? So he did.
So
and
that got him into some trouble.
That got him into a lot of trouble because their attitude, I think, was that he should, if it doesn't work, you come home and report out, and then you can go back a second time. And his attitude is, are you kidding? They're never going to let me in again. So he's going to stay no matter what. And that's what the November 8th letter is about. And that's why November 26th, he says, let me tell you what this arrangement's going to be. I'm staying. So he arrives in Minsk on January 6th, and the Soviets are very suspicious of him, and they assign about 30 agents to track him around. So if he, and no matter what he does, he takes a tram, he goes to the movies. There's always these reports being filed, and one thing happens after another. So the reports, which were published in a book called "Passport to Assassination" by Nechaporenko. So Oswald gets on the tram. He went here. He went to a movie house. He sat in the 11th row. Then he went over here to the store. He bought vanilla cookies. I mean, but it's already over. There's nothing more to follow him around about. Okay. Because one of the things they did is there's a famous scientist who was then 26 years old, who was assigned by the KGB to test Russia, to test Oswald, to see how much Russian he already knew, to see if he knew too much too soon. And so this guy, do you remember his name? We can put it in later. I just don't remember his name right now. He became very famous and was involved in the fall of the Soviet Union and met with President Clinton. But this guy was tutoring Oswald for a few weeks, and I forget his name right now. Okay, and that was in February of 1960. And apparently Oswald faked it enough that he didn't, he knew he was being kept under observation and being quizzed and all that, and nothing happened. So subsequently, this scientist met with Clinton and was involved with the fall of the Soviet Union, and there's great color photographs of him in Clinton. Okay, so where were we now?
Well, let's go to the plan was to get Oswald out of the Soviet Union by going to Albert Schweitzer College
here's
for
the
a
deal.
debrief, but that didn't happen.
Yeah, let's talk about that. The original plan was that when Oswald exited the when Oswald was through with his time in Russia, he would go to Switzerland, to Albert Schweitzer College, which it turns out has connections with the man who was a close friend of Allen Dulles. So as far as I'm concerned, it's practically the functional equivalent of a CIA front. But he's supposedly going there to study philosophy. So he applied to Albert Schweitzer College for the spring term of 1960 before he even left the United States. So clearly, that was the plan. That was the plan. And he never showed up at Albert Schweitzer College because he never left the Soviet Union. When he was ready to leave, he came directly back to the United States. But the plan was for him to go to Switzerland, and I think he was going to be parked in Switzerland. And of course, this would have worked out fine because when the 1960 convention came around, if Johnson got on the ticket, they could bring Oswald in from that parking lot when they wanted him and use him as the patsy in what I believe to be was originally scheduled to be a much earlier version of this thing in 1961, but it didn't happen that way.
And he didn't come back then, and so he felt he was in trouble.
I think Oswald knew that he was, and I think he was worried about the prosecution. And he writes about that in the letters, which I was talking about. Yes, and those letters start in 1961 May. Okay. It happens 3 or 4 times, and he writes a letter to the State Department. And when he meets with at the United States Embassy, he actually tells them that the guy writes a memo in June 1961 that Oswald was worried about coming home to a long jail term. And get this, and then he puts in the memo, and this is the exact quote, for his act of remaining in the Soviet Union. Remaining. As if there was no problem with him having gone to the Soviet Union. It was the remaining in the Soviet Union. And it's a giveaway. But nobody sees that because they don't understand that Oswald's an agent at that level.
So there is communication then with Oswald that we want you to come back. You won't be prosecuted.
Well, no, we don't know what they said. Well, yes, the State Department at the embassy said to him, we don't know what you're talking about. We think you're fine. Why don't you come on home? Okay. Well, meanwhile, Oswald had taken out this insurance policy, which was the marriage to Marina, so he could stay and become a Soviet citizen. Well, now she's pregnant, and he does not want to come home without her, and he won't come home without her. And that raises a very serious problem because she cannot travel with him on a direct route from Moscow to New York without what's called a special waiver called the 243G waiver from the State Department. And And in order to get a 243G waiver, your husband or whatever has to be in good standing. And the San Antonio district director, who was in charge of this, took one look at the Oswald file and not being in the know about any of this, said, hell no. So he rejected the 243G waiver application, and that meant that there had to be all kinds of politics going on, which went to the top of the Justice Department in March of 1962 to get the 243G waiver. Without the 243G waiver,
he wouldn't have been able.
She wouldn't come home directly, and they couldn't send Oswald to. They could send him to a third country and say, come in from there. So in fact, they sent documents out saying, go to Belgium. They said, if Oswald has a problem with this, send him to Belgium, and we'll rush him back from Belgium. Okay. And I mean, who gives such special treatment? So this is Belgian traffic about going to Brussels to come in from Brussels. They're so touchy. The State Department is so aware. Somebody actually writes a telex, and I have this document when Oswald was about to come home in June 1962, and it's a very simple message: do not give cash to Oswald, because they're worried about him flying the coop. I mean, going to somewhere else. Wow. I mean, they're very skittish.
Him home.
They being, and I think they was Robert Kennedy, if you want to know the truth.
Okay.
Because I think Bobby Kennedy, who was running covert ops against Castro at the time, somebody sold him the bill of goods that, oh, you can use this guy in your covert operations. I think that somebody was Allen Dulles, and that's why Bobby Kennedy took a great interest in getting Oswald back home so he could use him in his covert ops, not knowing that he's being set up to have the future assassin of his brother be on his staff. Right. That's what that was all about, but that's another story.
Let's get to Oswald coming back on the Mazda.
Right.
You think that he was met there?
I'm sure he was met there, yes. And here's what happened. Oswald, when he finally got the 243G waiver about May 15th, 1962, they said, okay, now the green light, quit your job and come home. So he's now married Marina, as I told you the year before, and she's gotten pregnant. Now, that's not an accident either. He got her deliberately pregnant, and I can get into that in my book. I'm probably the only person who studied this matter about her period and all the rest of it. But he got her pregnant within a few weeks of meeting her. He was trying very hard, and she wanted to use birth control, and he would throw it against the wall. It's actually in Macmillan's book. He would say, no dice. Okay. So he got her pregnant deliberately, and the reason was to have a diplomatic hostage, you might say, and to have an escape plan. He wanted to have a Russian wife. And he was willing to do that. Anyway, she's beautiful at the time, and she was gorgeous. And anyway, so it comes time to come home, and he wants to come home by jet. He actually writes a letter to the U.S. Embassy saying, why don't you tell the commandant in Berlin about me so I can get on a train, go to Berlin, and get a military jet to come back to the United States, which is very peculiar if he was the ordinary defective. Of course, that didn't happen. But then he renewed the thing at the embassy. He said repeatedly that he wanted to come home by jet. And they said, are you kidding? You're coming home in the lowest class of the lowest boat. So it turns out that he comes home on a thing called the SS Mazdam. Now, before he comes home, he first has to go to this city on the outskirts of Moscow, this area, and he stays at a place called the Ostankino. I've just done research on this just in the last year, and I think that's where the first place he went. I think there was a meeting there or something, but he's there for a few days, and then he comes to Moscow, and he goes home and they get him a trip home on the Mazdam, the SS Mazdam. Now, as soon as he comes home, it's a 10-day voyage. He's back in Texas, and he's already behaving like a Marxist again. And the question became, and this was back in 1984 and 1985, when did this happen? No, I'm sorry, this is in the early 1990s. How in the world did Lee Oswald, why was he suddenly back home and behaving like a Marxist when he was leaving Russia supposedly in disgust with communism? And I couldn't figure out where they had a meeting or what was going on. And I figured, well, it must either happened in Russia or it happened when he got back to the U.S. The problem with these hypotheses are, if he gets back to the U.S. and announces at the airport, hey, I'm Lee Harvey Oswald, I'm a writer and I have a manuscript, it's over. They can't use him as a patsy, because then he's blown his cover. He's basically said, I'm an actor, and I was pretending to be a Marxist, but I'm not a Marxist. Okay, so what happened is, I was looking at this and trying to figure out, there are only 4 periods in his life: youth, Marines, Russia, post-Russian. But then it turned out, and I made this discovery around 1990, 91, I said, my God, there's a 5th period tucked between the 3rd and the 4th. It's the 10-day boat ride on the Mazdam. What happened on that boat ride? So there was a 5th period. The 5th period was the period between the Russian period and the post-Russian period, which is what's called the period after he returns in June 62. to the United States. That period from June 62 to the day of the assassination is called in FBI files, and I call it to the post-Russian period.
Okay.
Previous to that is the Russian period. Okay. In between is the boat ride. Well, it turns out that there's good evidence, excuse me, that he was met on the boat. And the evidence for that is that Oswald generates about 21, excuse me, 21, Oswald generates about 21 pages of notes from the boat ride. And Edward Epstein, in his book about Oswald called Legend, published in 1977, had a handwriting expert analyze these writings. And one of the things he said was, one of the peculiar things about these writings is what he called evidence of dictation in the writings. And then Epstein, and this is in a footnote, says, but who would be dictating to Oswald? And he just left it at that. Well, I remember the morning I discovered this. I was in a deli in Santa Monica and reading through some stuff on it. I said, wow, that's the evidence that someone's talking to Oswald on the boat, and he's writing down what the person's saying. That's why there's evidence of dictation. And what Oswald had been writing down was this bizarre essay about a radical, being a political radical. So somebody on the boat was briefing Oswald, it seemed to me, as to his next assignment, you might say. And what was really the giveaway was that part of these writings, what?
You want me to?
No, I'll be fine. Part of these writings were a list of 10 questions or 11 questions. And for each question, there were 2 answers. So you have question 1 and then A1 and A2. Question 2 and then, B, number 2-1 and 2A and 2B. Question 3, A and B. And one said he was a communist in one of the answers, and the other said he was different. And anyway, to cut to the chase.
Is that record that's available?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And the silly Warren Commission says, well, he was preparing to have a news conference. That's so silly. Somebody was briefing him on what answers to give the FBI so the file could be closed, because Oswald's original file designation would be an espionage case.
Okay.
And they didn't want that because they couldn't move him around post-Russian period.
They need that file
if the
closed.
spotlight is on him all the time. Right. They want the file closed. So they briefed him on how to answer questions in connection with this other essay he was writing. The bottom line is that there's your written evidence that he was met on the boat. But it even gets better, because there was a guy there's a whole bunch of wonderful people who helped me with best evidence. And there was a guy in Holland who was a friend of mine who says, he called me up one day, he's a musician, he said, anything I can do? I said, yes. I said, get the Mazdam passenger list, So because I don't speak Dutch. So he went over there and he got this list and he worked with me and he interviewed people in Holland. I have these faxes. And we found some interesting stuff. Which I can't remember by heart right now, but it was good stuff. And it really brings the whole Mazdam voyage to light. And I believe Oswald was met on the Mazdam, yes, and briefed, or debriefed, or whatever.
By a person working for whom?
Okay. In order to have the threat of prosecution, there has to be someone there from the Justice Department, basically a Bobby Kennedy representative, saying, look, you're going to do this our way, or you're going to be prosecuted, blah, blah, blah. So somebody from DOJ has to be there. But then there's somebody who, I suppose, who just befriended him. It's my personal opinion, can't prove it right now, it's my personal opinion that George de Mohrenschildt was on the boat. De Mohrenschildt says he first met Oswald in September of '62. I believe he went on the Mazdam and met him there, and I have reasons for believing that, and it'll be in my manuscript. But it's not a cut and dry case. But they had someone, he's from Minsk originally, he speaks fluent Russian, and I think he... Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, and I think de Mohrenschildt, in a way, was the handler, but he's not part of any plot to kill Kennedy. But he's a friend of the Kennedys, of Jacqueline certainly, and so that's connected with his trip home.
That's the connection.
Yeah, that's the connection.
So let's bring him home if we can.
Yeah, well,
Oswald home.
Yeah, he comes home. Oh, sure. So Oswald comes home on June 12th or 13th. Let's see, he gets home on June 13th, 1962. The very first thing he does, he goes to the steno the next Monday, the 16th, 17th, and 18th, I believe are the dates. He spends 3 days with the steno going through his 15,000 words of notes, getting them all typed up. Okay. We don't have that record.
Was that in Dallas, by the way? Or
that's in Fort Worth. Okay. And during that period, because of a connection, a reporter for the Fort Worth Press hears of Oswald and wants to co-write with him. And that reporter is named Johnny Tackett, and he writes him a letter. And Oswald doesn't meet with him. But anyway, I looked up Tackett, and we have a beautiful filmed interview of Johnny Tackett in 1990, in which I show him the manuscript in the middle of the interview, and he's really surprised at the fact, because and he looks at the manuscript and he says to me, I still think he murdered President Kennedy. I mean, that's how strong the hold was. This whole idea of showing someone's a writer, it's not going to break the hold that he's not an assassin. Right. And that happened with Johnny Tackett, too. So where are we now? Let's just...
Well, so from 62 when he came home, and you had mentioned earlier that he's not pretending, but he seems to be a Marxist.
Oh yeah, now
and that part was surprising, given that.
Yes, but he's now back doing something for the for intelligence.
So he has another assignment.
Yeah, and what's great about and here's what's great about this, because from June 62 he gets the notes typed out. Now he starts to write his manuscript, and we have the manuscript, and it's 17,000 words or something, and it's published in the Warren Commission, and then it's typed up. So we have the manuscript. And what's great about this whole situation is that during this period when he's pretending to be a Marxist, and I'll tell you what he's doing in a minute, he's writing the anti-communist manuscript. That's the proof that it's all pretense. So what he's done is, during this period, he tries to join the Socialist Workers' Party on October 29th, 1962, and they say to him, no, there's not enough people have a chapter out there. But he talks about it. He loves the SWP. He subscribes to the communist newspapers. He sends them samples of his photographic work. He's working at a graphics arts house, and says, can I help with the photography of the Daily Worker and for the social, or the Militant, the newspaper of the Socialist Workers' Party. So he's definitely pretending to be a communist. At the same time, he's writing an anti-communist manuscript about Russia. When I say anti-communist, not John Birch anti-communist, just like Walter Cronkite anti-communist, a middle-of-the-road guy who's talking about all the deficiencies of the Russian system when it comes to buying a car, getting property, doing this, getting that, getting an education. He writes about it all in his manuscript called The Collective, which the steno said was going to be called Inside Russia. Okay. So that's the deal on Oswald in the fall of 62. Okay. Now, he has the manuscript. We now get to the end of 1962. We're into now January 63. Now, something happens there where his agency connection, whatever he's doing, takes a turn towards violence, because in January he orders a pistol, and in March he orders a rifle. This is going to be the pistol that supposedly killed Officer Tippit, but the rifle that supposedly killed President Kennedy. That's on March 12th he places the order. It's shipped on March 20th or something like that. Now, however, in January 1963, this is the first quarter of 63, all this is going down. In January, he signs up for typing lessons, you see, because... Now,
he
why?
wants to work on his manuscript.
He wants to work on his manuscript, and he doesn't own a typewriter. Now, I located the... what's her name again? The typing teacher's name? I forget her. Gladys Yoakum. And I was able to interview Gladys Yoakum on camera in 1996 in a fairly extensive interview at her home. She died 6 months later. She was in the 90s, but she was pretty sharp. I have great film footage of that, and we can show it, of Gladys Yoakum. And he sat in the back working on his own stuff, she said. And Gladys Yoakum loved President Kennedy and all the rest. Okay, so Oswald's working on his manuscript, and the last typing class, when he had access to the typewriter, was in late March 1963. Now, during this same period that he's working on his manuscript, apparently he's planning to shoot General Walker, which is very funny, because the Walker shooting, whoever the handler is in this, has dreamed up the scheme to make the Walker shooting the stalking horse for the Kennedy assassination. And you have to look up the word stalking horse and understand what that means. That he's doing this and that and the other for this Walker assignment, but after the fact, it's going to be looking like the fact this guy's just a murderer who runs around shooting public officials,
You mentioned a couple things, David.
Yeah.
You mentioned handler, that you might comment a little bit more on, and then you mentioned the Walker shooting being the stalking horse.
Yes.
And so tell us a little bit more about what that means.
Okay.
First handler.
A handler
what do you think was going on?
The handler, the relationship between an agent and a handler is the relationship between an actor and a director. So Oswald had a handler, which means he wasn't just left to his own. He wasn't just told, here, kid, go out in the field and pretend to be a Marxist. Tell us how you're doing in a few months. He's given day-to-day guidance. There had to be many meetings. So do this, do that, write the Communist Party, do this. Now, tell your wife this, do this. And then we're setting this up for April 10th. You're going to go and take a shot at Walker, a fake shot at Walker. It's a deliberate missed shot. And guess what? April 10th happened. April 11th is the day that Congressman Thomas says he's resigning. I mean, it's all coordinated. All this stuff's happening down at the same time. In early March, in mid-March 1963, there's a very important CIA file I discovered, which is called Plots to Assassinate the President of the United States. And it's one digit removed from stuff relating to Oswald, which has been called the smoking file. To make a long story short, Oswald was, I believe, had the mission of being a pretend assassin. So Oswald was to assassination the way a DEA agent opens up a drug deal. It's a fake drug deal. He's trying to ensnare other drug dealers, find people who are drug users. Oswald was told he's a pretend assassin, so he has the rifle, he's going to fire the rifle, he's going to pretend he's going to go look for other radicals to commingle with, report back, all the kind of stuff that an agent does. And I think that's the way he was set up. He thinks he's a pretend assassin. And the Walker shooting was part of establishing his cover as this radical on the loose in the Dallas area. That's what I think.
Okay. Never purposely intended to shoot him.
No, I think it was under the guidance of a handler. I don't even think, I think he was, we know for sure he came back and told Marina, I just fired at General Walker. And we know there's a supposedly near miss of Walker that night. I don't know that Oswald actually stood at the fence with the rifle.
Okay.
I think somebody may have fired a shot.
Okay.
And I don't even know that Walker's not in on it. I mean, Walker may be in on this part of the charade. I don't know.
Okay.
He certainly didn't like
But
President
it served
Kennedy.
the purpose of connecting Oswald with
Violence. Oh, absolutely.
Exactly.
And there's articles that appear on the
huge.
internet. It's huge to this day. And it also served the purpose at a very personal level. Marina, once Oswald came marching in the house that night and saying, I just tried to kill General Walker. She said, who's General Walker? And he explained. He said, well, he has to die, blah, blah, blah.
So he's in a role, even with his wife.
Yes, he kept the truth about himself from his wife. He's in a role. He's role-playing in front of his wife. And therefore, she believed on the day of the assassination that he was personally capable of shooting President Kennedy because despite all the fact that he obviously liked President Kennedy, he had shot at General Walker, and this showed her that he was a man who would kill a political figure.
So is it fair to say, and I don't want to jump too far ahead of the story, but it's timely right here, she really didn't know him.
No, she didn't.
Because he didn't let her know him.
That's right. He kept her. Yeah.
So he played a role not just when he left the house.
Right.
He was in a role play.
He played
the
role
whole
to
time.
the hilt. He kept a picture of Castro above the mantelpiece. You know, people who don't understand this say, well, Oswald was really a Marxist. Look, he kept a picture of Castro at home. He lived the legend. That was his role. And when I interviewed Marina, when I had a little film left on the camera, I said, Marina, if Lee could come home and reappear today, what question would you ask him? If you had one question. She said, well, you know, years ago it would have been, did you kill the president? She said, but I know now that he didn't do that, she says. Then she says, pause, and there's this great Greta Garbo look, and she looks at the camera and she says, I would say to him, who are you?
Wow. Who are you?
Yeah, she didn't know who he was at the end. She knew he loved his children, and she knew he liked President Kennedy, but she couldn't figure it out because he kept her in the dark.
Sure. Well, let's continue the story. You've talked about ordering the pistol, ordering the rifle, the attempt on Walker's life.
The attempt, which is a fake attempt.
A fake attempt on Walker's life. So let's get closer then to November 22nd.
Okay, no, let's not skip over New Orleans. And then the summer, the whole summer of '63, from April 24th or whatever through September 24th, he's in New Orleans, and that peaks in August with the business of him handing out Fair Play for Cuba leaflets, and he's on the radio twice to promote this whole business of being the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. So he's now established a media image. By the way, that's done with a handler. There's nobody said to Oswald, see if you can capitalize on your status there. No, it is really done, chapter and verse. He's meeting with somebody, and it's done so that within an hour of Kennedy's shooting, they're rolling tape of Oswald handing out Fair Play for Cuba Committee stuff.
They've got it ready to go.
They've got it ready to go because he's created the legend. It's beautifully done. It's really excellently done. Now we come to the end of September 1963. Some very interesting developments. First of all, there's a series of letters indicating he may be in another city. He might go to Baltimore. He might go to Philadelphia. I think that maybe there was some uncertainty as to whether this would come off in Dallas. So they're going to move their guy some other. He's like a shield behind which they're going to hide so they can move him to another city. That didn't happen, obviously. Then there's this business of him going to Mexico City. And he goes to Mexico City on September 27th. Well, he goes to Mexico City on September 27th, between September 27th, 63, and October 3rd. And it's a trip down by bus and back. And he goes to the embassies, you know, he makes provocative statements. And what's that all about? And the answer is that I think that's all about dragging Castro into Oswald's legend and making him look like an agent of the Castro government. So that's what that was all about. And he comes back and suddenly he gets a job at the Texas School Book Depository. Now, that did not happen by accident. If you don't know how deep this runs, you can easily mistakenly think, you know, Oswald got a job there, so they decided to kill President Kennedy at Dealey Plaza. That's not how it worked. This whole thing was site-selected to begin with, and I now know how they planned to get Oswald the job at the building. Texas School Book Depository Company was at a different site. It was across the street in Dallas. at 501 Elm. So suddenly in 1962 or late 62, he moves his operation into 411 Elm, which is the Texas, which we now call the Texas School Book Depository, what was for decades the Sexton Grocery Company. So they had to arrange that shift. Then they had to do something other that was peculiar. Put the warehouse on the 6th floor and the 7th floor. When you have trains bringing in books, you put the books down where they get off the train. You don't put the books upstairs, but they have a story there. This is like writing a screenplay. They're going to have the story of a man who works in the book warehouse. So they had to put the books upstairs, and some of that involved an elevator that goes upstairs. They already had an elevator in the building, but they had to build one to the offices on the 4th floor. It's a whole business of what's going on in the building. They really didn't move into the building until July 63. And they put the letters on the side of the building, Texas School Book Depository. Now, how are you going to arrange to have Oswald get a job there and make it look like an accident? It's real easy. What they did is they posted a notice out in Irving, Texas, in some location where Oswald could say, I saw the notice and I'm asking for this job. That's the way it would have gone down if it was going down as planned. But to the great luck of these people, it turns out that Oswald's neighbor was Linnie Mae Randall, and her brother got a job at the TSBD through that notice. I don't think, by the way, that's coincidence. They wanted to have Oswald have a ride out to Irving, Texas. So when he applied, they said, okay, you have a car, good enough, you can work here. So starting on September 10th, Buell Wesley Frazier was the job that was going to be Oswald's future ride.
Because Oswald didn't drive.
Right, because Oswald didn't drive.
Okay.
But on when Oswald got back from Mexico City, he didn't have to go to take that notice and cash in his chips. What happened is Ruth Payne knew about this job through Linnie Mae Randall. So it looks like a genuine coincidence. And unfortunately for Ruth Payne, if you start saying there's a conspiracy, she gets dragged into it. But she didn't. I don't think she did anything wrong. I think she just called Roy Truly and said, you know, I heard from Linnie Mae there's this job. So that's what happened. So starting on October 16th, Lee Oswald is working at the crime scene to be. That's the way to look at it.
So slightly over 1 month before the assassination, he gets a job at the prime location.
Yeah, he's hired by the but this is a location which is, the building has to be owned by the people connected with this, and Harry and Byrd, Mr. Byrd, Colonel Byrd, who owns that building, is in fact a friend of Lyndon Johnson. That's just a fact. And there's pictures of the two of them together and stuff. Okay, so now the question becomes, and I think we should jump to this right now because that's why my book is called Final Charade.
Okay.
On November 22nd, the way this is set up is that the president's going to come down the street. The plaza is booby-trapped. You've got people who are going to kill President Kennedy. Now, all very well, but how are you going to make it appear that the shots came from upstairs? Well, you know, in that building, it's not just enough to play with the body. That's later. You might say even hours or months later with the autopsy report. What about in real time? How do you make it look like the shots came from the building? Well, obviously you have to have someone up there who looks like or poses as the assassin and fires blanks or something. And if you think about it, and I've thought about this a lot, who better to play that role but Lee Harvey Oswald? So the question is, how do you get him to do that? Now, a lot of people come at this and they think that Oswald's some kind of a dope who's simply in the building by accident, and he's a good communist and he got framed for this. That's not the way it worked. First of all, he's a pretend communist, but you got to dream up a mission which would involve having him get involved in staging a mock attack against the president. And that's what I think happened here, that they dreamed up this idea that he would be, and they sold it to him, that he had this assignment that with Bobby Kennedy's approval, that they're going to stage a mock attack against the president, fire some blanks, in order that Bobby can pick up some people who are involved in a plot to kill the president. Let me backtrack here. In the 50s, it became very clear that conversation wasn't enough to get an indictment. You had to have, quote, an overt act. And I think Lee Oswald was told that there was a coup in the works, there was a plan to overthrow the government, there were these bad guys, and that Bobby could arrest them if they had an overt act. And the government was planning to use him as an undercover operative, a pretend assassin who fires some blanks, then be able to pick up these bad guys, some generals or whatever, pick them up, arrest them, and Lee's going to be a hero for having assisted the government in bringing this clique to justice. And so the reason my book is titled Final Charade is that part of it has to do with how Oswald was sold this bill of goods. But secondly, that some word of this actually reached the Dallas Police Department. And there's a memo I have from a person in the Hunt organization dated about November 4th, 1963. And this guy writes, you know, he writes to his superior, we have word that there's supposed to be an event staged with the approval of President Kennedy, you know, and which would redound to the disadvantage of the right. and maybe we should write a letter to the editor to expose this plan before the president's visit. So that's what's going on with Oswald. He's snookered into the idea that he's engaged in a legitimate, fully law enforcement charade, and that he's going to fire blanks, and that he will be taken into custody, and that he will talk about, well, we skipped a part of the story here. Alex Heidel was the alias he set up, and that supposedly Heidel fired these blanks, and that he knew Heidel, and there's a story, and they'll go on for 12 hours or something, and then these guys will get arrested, and Oswald will be one of the heroes of the movement.
And so these people that they were trying to smoke out were going to...
This is a hypothetical story told to Oswald.
Yeah, but the hypothetical story was that once it appears as though Kennedy was shot or killed...
Well, then I hear that have their overt act. Well, in other words, no, you don't even have to kill him. No, you don't have to pretend he's dead. No, once the shots are fired, and Oswald could appear in court and say that, you know, he had been told there's an authorized undercover assignment that this what this group wanted to do, and it's just like instead of using, you know, bad drugs, he put water in the bottles. He fired blanks. That Bobby then could arrest these people. No, it's a story.
That Bobby would arrest these people for doing what?
For conspiring to kill the president.
And where were they since?
I don't know. It's a screenplay. It's a story stuffed into Oswald's head.
It's a story that he was told.
Yeah, which is why on November 8th, when he first was told this thing, he writes this thing called the Hunt letter. Right. Dear Mr. Hunt, what is my position? I think we should meet and have further information before I or anyone else take further action on this regard, or something like that. I believe the Hunt letter is real. It reflected confusion in his mind as to what was going down as of November 8th. And it's reflective also of the November 4th memorandum, which is real inside the Hunt organization, that we heard at the police department there's going to be this staged event or something. Yeah. So I think that's the way Oswald was handled in connection with the lead up to November 22nd. He thinks he's a pretend assassin, and he's going to stage this mock attack. He has no idea that during the time he's firing blanks, real bullets are going to take out the president. Nor does he know that within minutes of doing that, he's going to be shot dead himself by an officer who runs into the building and says, "Hey, I've got the assassin here."
So you're saying that Oswald was supposed to be killed,
right,
in the role, if you will, on the 6th floor,
an actor, or running down the stairway, or something like that.
Okay, and that didn't happen because he wasn't on the 6th floor. He was already on the 2nd floor.
He got down fast enough. Yeah. He took the elevator down or something. He got downstairs before Officer Baker could get upstairs.
Okay.
And the result was there was this peculiar confrontation at the Coke machine where Baker takes out his gun, and and then he can't shoot anybody. I mean, come on, the guy's on the 2nd floor and he has a Coke in his hand. And in my book, I wrote, what was he going to do? Say, drop the Coke or I'll shoot? And so the result of that is that Oswald got out of the building.
Got out of the building.
And then there's a whole other drama that unfolds when they're chasing him around and trying to catch him. And then there's the shooting of Officer Tippit, which I don't think we should get into that much. But except for one thing, that when Oswald leaves the building, there's about 5 witnesses that see him get into a station wagon. And on the other hand, the Warren report says he got onto a bus. Now, the station wagon would be going away to the west, and the bus was to the east. And people say, well, if you believe the station wagon witnesses, then he couldn't have gotten on the bus. And there's these complicated and silly theories that there's an imposter running around. None of that is true. I solved this in 1971 on my trip to Dallas when I interviewed the car stop witnesses. You look at the AAA maps, and today you can do this on MapQuest, and nobody knows this, but it's on this camera now. We're recording it. If you get into a station wagon and you go west away from the building onto the Stemmons Freeway, if you get off at the first exit and you loop around, you end up to where he got on the bus. And it's about 2 minutes away. So I think he was picked up, he was extracted from the situation by one of the handlers or people connected with this. He was told what to do next, which is to go back to his rooming house and then go to such and such location. Because they're trying to kill him. They got to kill this guy. So he gets into the station wagon, loops around to the bus station, and gets on the bus. Well, the next thing they're going to do is get him on the bus. The trouble is that Oswald's very antsy, and the bus was stopped in traffic, so he got off the bus and took a taxi. But immediately after he got off from the bus, or shortly after, police boarded the bus and started searching people for weapons. That's not known today, the connections that I've just made here. So that's what happened. So then he gets into the taxi, goes to his rooming house, then there's a small dotted line when he ends up at the Tippit location. I think there is a shooting. Tippit got shot. I don't think Oswald did it. He ran to the movie theater. He was arrested. And they could have gotten killed in the theater. He ended up being arrested alive and saying things like, I didn't kill anybody, I'm just a patsy. But here's the big thing about Oswald. He doesn't know that President Kennedy's been shot until 12 hours later. He thinks all the tumult outside is his charade. You got to understand his POV, his reality. In Oswald's reality, he's created this tumult. He's the star of the show. Okay? He does not know there's been a real shooting during his mock attack. for years, the question was, how did they get Oswald up in that window? And it's a very interesting question. And the question was, what story was told to Oswald? And we went round and round, me and close friends of mine went round and round with different stories, trying to figure out what story worked to open this lock. It was like a key in the lock situation. And we finally figured out it had to do with the story about a coup, and there's reasons for believing this. Why would he believe this story? Who told it to him? Who do you think he's working for? The realization that Lee Oswald thinks he's working for Bobby Kennedy is not just a theory about what's going on in his head. There's evidence that there's evidence that backs this up, that there's in fact a Bobby Kennedy-Oswald connection. I made the discovery years ago that on Oswald's CIA file, his 201 file, is a box where you put in other identification, and inside that box is written AG. Now, AG means Attorney General. And I said, whoopee, so that somebody is trying to create this connection, or it's a real connection. It didn't matter to me. The point is that when Bobby Kennedy looks at it through his end of the telescope, he sees that Oswald's down on the food chain somewhere, one of his operatives. When Lee Oswald looks at it from his end of the telescope, he says, I'm working for the Oval Office. I'm working for the president's brother. Right. Okay. Then it was brought to my attention, well, AG actually means Russian defector. And for years I went along with this until very recently, this is the last 2 to 5 months, I was looking into this matter, and I found out that when you look in the security classified testimony, that this whole explanation that AG means Russian defector, this didn't happen until 1964. And what happened in 1964, I think, is that Bobby Kennedy, trying to get out of this hole that was dug for him by those who were trying to frame him and connect him with Oswald, had this problem that the file was marked AG. So what they did is, in computer talk, they redefined the system architecture. And this guy testified, well, this order came down, or this instruction came down, we're going to have these new codes. And AG means Russian defector, which is really hilarious in a way. And so they put AG on Oswald's file and on some other files, and so they got away with it. And anyway, it never came to the attention of the Warren Commission. It did to the House Select Committee 13 years later. So yes, I believe there's an RFK Oswald connection. It's part of the blackmail neutralizing him. But that is only part of the story. That has to do with the letters AG. Oh, by the way, one of the chief people who were the assistant to Angleton gave this top secret testimony, which was declassified for me a couple of years ago. And he's asked about AG. Everybody's asked about this AG thing. And he says, what does AG mean? He says, Attorney General. This is under oath. So yeah, I think it means Attorney General. Now, here's what's really more important and what got me turned on. In 1968, a book was published in Europe, published in Liechtenstein or something. It was called America. No, it was called America Burning. And it was a big, huge bestseller all over Europe. And it was written by somebody who was an insider, who seemed to know the Kennedys and blah, 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 what was going on. And it made clear that there was a big high-level plot involving possibly the Secret Service. Well, anyway, it involved a lot of people, and it was very knowledgeable. Well, the book was published in this country as Farewell America. And I paid some attention to it, but not enough. Well, then anyway, in 2006, I was rereading this book, and I was saying, where have I seen this style before? I'm a writer. I can recognize another writer's style, like looking at a fingerprint or something. I'm saying, and then it was in February 2006, and I had this eureka experience, and I said, oh, I know who wrote this, because it was obvious from some of the phraseology. It's Arthur Schlesinger.
Really?
And I said, this has got to be Arthur Schlesinger. So I was busy with a lot of stuff, and I said, I'm not going to be able to prove this, but I'm going to ask this. So I asked this woman, Paula Botan, who was very smart, and I don't know if she's got her degree yet in college, but anyway, I said, Paula, I want you to take 1,000 Days by Arthur Schlesinger, and I want you to take Farewell America, and I'll give you these passages. Just look up, anytime you see something in Farewell America about such and such, look it up in 1,000 Days and see if the passages are similar. Well, the correlation was so similar that any professor would say, if they saw that correlation,
it's
hey,
been plagiarized.
That's plagiarized, man. You're flunked. And I mean, there's so many of these things. So as far as I'm concerned, yes, Arthur M. Schlesinger is the author or co-author of Farewell America, along with Theodore Sorensen, because there was stuff in there that was very Sorensen-ish. But basically, it's Arthur Schlesinger. Now, I have not had the money or the time to go to Schlesinger's children, and he has a son named Stephen and probably some others, and to go to his papers. But I think this is really got to be proven. Now, why is it so important? Well, okay, when did I tell you that I figured out the business about the charade? That happened in 1995, that Oswald's firing blanks. And there's a bunch of other stuff about Oswald that I figured out like decades later. The Walker shootings, pretense, that was 1975, almost a decade after the assassination. You go to this chapter at the end of this book, Farewell America, which has a chapter on Oswald called Bobo. which was the name under which they buried Oswald in the Fort Worth Cemetery, William Bobo, to prevent grave theft and stuff. Well, this chapter is loaded with insights, and this business about a mock attack is mentioned 3 or 4 times.
Is it really?
Yeah, 3 times at least. And I'm saying, hey, wait a minute. How did Arthur Schlesinger, if he wrote this, how did he find this out in '68? I didn't get this until 1995.
The mock attack is mentioned in...
Yeah, a simulated assassination attempt, yes, as the way they got the framed Oswald, who thought he was, quote unquote, well covered because of his connection with the government and everything. So I got real excited about that, and as far as I was concerned, that was the cherry on the sundae. That meant to me that Bobby Kennedy, Sir Arthur Schlesinger did not investigate the assassination. Anything he wrote in his book, he's getting from Bobby. Kennedy. So Bobby knew the truth about how his agent got framed, and he told some of it to Arthur Schlesinger, who put it in the book. And that was my opinion about Farewell America, and I was very excited about this. Now, there's something else I wanted to say about this. Now, what was it? I could firmly connect this chapter. Oh, he also talked about the structure of the plot in the book. He called it the committee, and he talked about how this committee worked. It's very clear the whole thing is an inside job, only he published, I remember what it was. This book was published in Europe, and the publisher in France said that in the summer of '68 we'll reveal who the true author was. Well, that's when Bobby's running, and I think this was part of Bobby's attempt to take back the White House.
Do you really?
He had this book published. He helped Schlesinger with it a little bit. It was published in Europe. It was a big bestseller in a number of countries. It was here, and then Bobby got assassinated. So then the book title got changed, by the way, from The Plot to Farewell America. So that's the story, and we can elaborate on it more another time. But yes, I believe that Farewell America contains corroborating evidence for the mock attack because it's in the chapter. It's called A Simulated Assassination. So,
do you think Bobby Kennedy made any efforts to have anybody talk with Oswald while he was in custody?
Yes. Okay, that's very important. Yes. When Oswald was arrested, they held him, in Oswald's own words to the American Civil Liberties Union, "I'm being held incommunicado." They held him incommunicado. He did not know what was happening, and he did not know that he was being held as the prime suspect in the Kennedy assassination. And he did not know that until almost midnight on Friday night. And that's when he comes before the microphones, and they said, "Did you kill the president?" And he says, "I've not been charged with that. The first thing I heard about that was when somebody talked to me about that in the hall." And then some reporter yells out, "You have been charged." And there's this look on his face. He looks really upset, and "You have been charged." And then another voice yells out, "Get him out of here." Anyway, he's gotten away. He's put back in jail at 12:20.
Is that the first time you think he was made aware that the president was dead?
Yeah. Yes, they held from him the fact that he's charged, because if he's charged and arraigned for the murder, then he knows there's really been a murder. Dead. So his reality is such that he's still existing in this mock attack reality.
So he's still in the role.
He's still in the role of thinking that, and he said, "But I wish someone would come forward and offer me legal assistance." That's about the Tippit murder, the officer. So he doesn't, he's really, he doesn't know what's going on. Then he's checked back into the jail until 12:20. Then there's this mysterious checkout at 12:35. And that goes on till 1:05. And they say, well, when they were asked about it by the Warren Commission, the top officials say, well, it's for fingerprinting. But he'd already been fingerprinted at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock.
So it was an excuse?
I think it was an excuse, and I think somebody spoke to Oswald during that period because of events that then happened. And I think that's somebody, my personal opinion is that it's somebody who's close to Bobby, and I think it was Walter Sheridan. I don't know how they got him in there. I don't know where they put him and what room they put him, but it certainly wasn't in the fingerprinting room, because there's an officer there who said, well, nobody was in here, so who knows how they did it, but he goes from 12:35 to 1:05 or something like that. Then at 1:35, supposedly he's arraigned. That's when he's told. Okay, but now he's been talked to. So he's been, anesthetized. They can handle it.
Okay, so he's still in the role.
But that's what he says. His comment, there's no record of the arraignment that was published at the time. It was not in the New York Times, nothing. We don't know about any arraignment until a year later when the Warren Report's published. But according to Chief Curry, Oswald said, "So that's the deal, is it?" or something like that. He made some wisecrack, and that was the end of it. So I think Oswald was kept in the dark deliberately. Now, the next day, Saturday, he's angry. And he says things like, and I was prepared to play it for the Bismarck audience. I don't know what dispatches you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges. I have committed no act of violence. You know, and there goes Oswald, you know, did you kill Governor Connolly? I have not shot anybody. Something like that. And we'll put that, we'll dub that in. That's the kind of situation he's in. Now, the next day, finally, they're able to kill him. Now, by the way, Friday night, before the press, when he's brought before the press, guess who's in the room? Jack Ruby. And Ruby told one person that he had a gun that night. I think they're trying to set it up either to kill him in the room or kill him during the arraignment or something. It doesn't happen.
But the sooner the better.
But sooner the better, because this guy knows who he is.
Right.
Oswald can bring down the Johnson presidency.
Yeah, wow.
The reason he can bring it down is that he has to simply say, I'm with the Central Intelligence Agency. This was Operation Silver Dollar 5. We were doing a mock attack authorized by the president's brother. Now, even if you can imagine the New York Times story. Suspect claims that blah, 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 mock attack. Sure, it's not going to maybe fly immediately, but believe me, that's the end of it. Because once you pull on the string of this kind of camouflage, it collapses eventually. Because the strength of it is that nobody knows it's there. So what are they going to do? So they get Ruby, and my research has shown that Ruby has told some story that Oswald is implicating him, and that the Jews, there's going to be another pogrom among the Jews, against the Jews. It's a whole story about the pogrom. But
what is the pogrom?
A pogrom is from, like, my father was born in Russia, and these Cossacks would come through and they, beat up the Jews and kill Jews and stuff like that.
Okay.
So Ruby, it was from that same generation. But the important thing that I want to tell the camera right now is that Oswald did not die of Ruby's bullet. And I knew about this in '67, but it was really brought to my attention in 2005 that Oswald died of air in the heart.
Really?
So, yes. And here's the deal.
So you're saying that Jack Ruby's bullet did not...
Jack Ruby's attack on Oswald, which, if was right in the heart, would have been fine for these plotters. But if he could be saved, and he was, his blood pressure was returning, Jack Ruby should be viewed as somebody who has an excuse to get him into Parkland Hospital, where the same clique can do to Oswald what they were supposed to, to kill him if necessary on the operating table, which they did.
You think he would have survived that gunshot?
Yes, I
possible
do.
That
because there was press release, and Malcolm Perry said it was surprising because his blood pressure was coming back. But what I do know for sure is that Dr. Joe Dickerson, who knew the pathologist, who testified on the Ruby defense team, knew about the fact that Oswald died of air. And I have a beautiful interview with Joe Dickerson in 2005 when he was 95 years old, sharp as a tack, and he told me and the camera about what he knew and how he knew it. And that Oswald had large blocks of air in his brain and throughout his system because there had been air in the IV line. So the same anesthesiologist who was intubating the corpse on Friday of John F. Kennedy, pretending he's alive when he's dead, was in charge of Oswald on Sunday. So yes, yeah. And you'll have to see the Joe Dickerson interview and the documents I have and get into the cold question of was there air in Oswald's system, and the answer is yes. According to Joe Dickerson there was, and according to the autopsy, the Oswald autopsy report talks of the air as if it's one of a number of factors, but Dickerson says it was the big one.
That's stunning.
Yeah, so I think that the proof of the long hand of the Parkland Hospital should be viewed, in my view, this as a movie production, as the special effects unit. On Friday, they were going to pretend Kennedy was alive when he's dead in order to change the facts of his death. On Sunday, they were going to make sure that Oswald was dead. He was murdered in the OR. Now, I'm not saying Ruby shouldn't be charged with attempted murder, but it just turns out to be the fact that Oswald could have been saved. Yes, I believe so.
So they wound Ruby up.
They wound Ruby up
by using a Jewish theme.
Yeah, right. That he's going to be. That's right. That there's going to be a pogrom against the Jews because Oswald was implicating him. Oswald was implicating Ruby, like who is the man behind Oswald. There's some such cockamamie story.
Yeah, that they would have told Ruby.
Yeah, they would have told Ruby. Yes.
So the idea that
is to get him to be able to get him set up, and the deputy, an assistant police chief was involved. I know somebody, and we'll use this in the film. His name is Rick Anderson, who's done some beautiful work to show that on Sunday they really set it up like a scene to be blocked out with an assistant police chief marking the spot on film where he's walking around there and kind of
on the floor of
the basement, right? Basically setting it up so when they bring Oswald down, they go to the right spot. And then Fritz isn't even looking anywhere. He marches by, and then Ruby jumps out of nowhere, which is not quite the way it happened. But anyway, yeah. But that's a whole, that's the mechanics of one of the subplots.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, I wanted to just say that there's much more. It's not a matter of an accident that Ruby, that Oswald died on set. He had to die. If he doesn't die, Johnson can't be president. Because he's walking around with the blueprint of the whole thing in his head. He doesn't know it's a blueprint. But the whole story of pretense and what he's supposed to be doing and who he's working for and why he went there and what he's supposed and what he was doing. I mean, can you imagine the amount of evidence that he's able? It's not open and shut, but I've spoken to the defense attorney about it. It would be tough. But he'd be able to say, look, I was a writer. Here's my manuscript. It's in Ruth Payne's garage. I came back. I did this. I did that. He'd be like John Dean at the Watergate hearings where he laid out all the things against President Nixon. Turns out they had tapes and they proved to be true. Lee Oswald would have to lay out the whole thing. Basically, I was with Mr. Smith, and they'd say, well, there was no Mr. Smith. He's that handler, that rogue handler guy. But anyway, they'd find the file that I found, plots to assassinate the President of the United States, dated March 4th, 1963, the rifle order on March 6th. They differ by 4 days.
Changing subject, you wanted to be sure to talk about the
route planning.
Yeah, and
well, we talked about a little bit about route planning.
Well, you mentioned the Daley Plaza and the
trees.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, a little bit.
Okay,
a little bit. I was in my storage area looking for photographs pertaining to John Connolly about a year ago or 2 years ago, and because I'd always thought that there's something funny about the trees in Dealey Plaza, and I was in there looking at photographs that happened to be going through a file of FBI crime lab photographs, and the FBI had brought cameras down to Dealey Plaza and photographed the plaza to show where Zapruder was standing, much more Nix, the different camera positions. And there's this tree in Dealey Plaza that's always been of interest to me because I think I see a man in that tree and some of these enlargements, which I stopped working on in '65 because they brought a lot of ridicule, and I don't want to get involved in that. Well, as the FBI camera, and it's still photographs, passes this tree, this tree has a big fork on November 22nd, but later it doesn't have the fork. What happened to this structure? Well, this camera is aimed right at this tree, and you can see where this piece of metal is strapped onto the tree. There's a false structure on the tree. And I think what happened is that they brought in, I think in booby trapping at Dealey Plaza, they brought in a landscape architect or something months before and put structure up there that they could use to support some snipers. This tree is one of them. And if you look at the pictures on November 22nd, there's a black police car up on the sidewalk near this tree. I think that's the security guy. In other words,
to keep people away? Yeah,
to keep people away, to keep the situation under control, right. And so if you look at the picture on November 22nd, you see this structure like a tuning fork. A year later, I think it is, there's no longer a tuning fork there. What happened to the other part of the structure? But what's great about this FBI photograph is you can see the thing that is like it's strapped on with a turnbuckle or something. And I'm willing to have experts look at it, and you tell me that I'm making that up. I'm not. And I think that same kind of structural modification took place elsewhere on the plaza, and that's why, and this is what's really important, at the time of the assassination, there's about 6 witnesses who talk about smoke coming from the trees. It's very prominent.
And they don't mean the trees right above the picket fence
area.
They mean areas. Trees higher than that.
Well, no, there's the picket fence business with the smoke. Okay. And then this tree I don't have a smoke witness for. Okay. I got structure. But what about the smoke coming from the trees, to the right front of the car? What's causing the smoke? I mean, since when do trees smoke like that?
Right.
But that happens on Dealey Plaza, and there's about 6 witnesses to it. People smell smoke and they see smoke.
Right.
So I think there's some kind of silenced guns going off or something like that in the tree.
Okay.
And in Dealey Plaza, in the book Feral America, he has a great passage which we could read into the soundtrack later in this project. And he says, the Kennedy assassination was the work of magicians. And it talks about the trickery that's involved. And then afterwards, even the scenery disappeared. I mean, it's a great paragraph written by Arthur Schlesinger, I'm sure, and based on information coming from RFK. And I think that's why RFK sent a friend of his to look into the whole situation at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the special forces are. He was looking to see who the snipers could be, I think. I don't know if he ever got to the bottom of it. I do not know that. But he sure knew a lot. And
so you've talked about this. It wasn't a coup because we didn't have an overthrow of the government. You talked about the the succession of Lyndon Johnson to the presidency through this murder of the president.
Right. The Constitution was used as a device to operate the line of succession and make Johnson president legally. So it's not a coup, because in a coup, the army marches. I mean, I used to say this to a publisher who was talking to me about this once. In a coup, I would call you, John, I can't meet you for lunch because, you know, we had the coup and the army closed the highway between our towns or something. So everybody knows there's a coup and we can't meet for lunch, and it's just an accepted fact. Here in this country, all the highways are open, everybody meets for lunch, but everybody believes this myth that the assassin was this man in the building with a $20 rifle, which is really silly. So what did happen? If it's not an overt coup, what would you call it, a covert coup? I think there's a better way to look at it. Because in a coup, you replace the government. The government was not replaced here. With the the Kennedy advisors stayed on because the government had already been penetrated. So many positions had been filled by Johnson. The most important one is Dean Rusk, as Secretary of State. They'd been lobbying because Kennedy wanted Fulbright. So already the Johnson government, or elements of it, were in place. So a better way to look at it is, I think, to call it a political decapitation. You decapitate the president, the vice president becomes president, but a lot of people he wants are already in position, and he just goes on with the government. What is that? You can call it a secret coup, or a coup within the constitutional framework, or a political decapitation, by whatever name. But it's not the standard thing with tanks in the street. No, it is not. And the public is under the belief that Oswald killed the president. The official position of this government is that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy. And Marina Oswald, that's what her fate is right now. She looks awful, by the way, recently. She used to be gorgeous. She looks awful. And the daughters have had to put up with this, and the family, and basically the American public. And it's debated on the internet with all kinds of people saying, oh, no, Oswald really killed the president. And it's a myth. It's a myth because the body was altered and the evidence is fraudulent. So that's the way this was designed to function, to make Lyndon Johnson president under circumstances that appear totally constitutional and a quirk of fate and a historical accident. And the guy that took the hit is Oswald, because he played the role of the assassin. He played a role, and evidence was falsified so that it was made to appear. So if he's going to act out the role of a pretend assassin and then you alter the body, he's going to look like the real assassin. And if you kill him, he'll never tell the story of what he was up to, and what he was doing, and who told him to do it.
This has been a very difficult crime to solve.
Very.
Because you've got the work of the federal government working against you in terms of their official version and the access to files, and so it's the assassination has been investigated by people on their own time, on their own money, throughout, in your case, your lifetime.
Right. But it's interesting, appearing here in Bismarck, when I was a graduate student, I brought the evidence of surgery to Professor Liebler's attention, and I put this in my, speech, which was streamed and everything. I said that, he was really upset when he saw the evidence in an FBI report that the body had been altered. And it took me a while to realize what upset him, because I thought that I uncovered this clever trick to hide the second assassin. But he realized the issue was fraud in the evidence. And he understood that, and so did Susan, his top law student, who he later married, and she became Susan Liebler. Okay, I didn't get it in the beginning. So he wants to write this memorandum, and I couldn't find the memorandum in time for this thing. And I called up the National Archives. I communicated with them by email. And there's a top-level official who's been very helpful to me in the past, and I hadn't been in touch with her for 5 years, and she's been promoted. She's head of this whole branch. And I said, look, I'm going to appear in Bismarck, and I got to have this memorandum, from Liebler to everybody on the commission about the body alteration. And Martha Wagner Murphy got it to me within 24 hours. That was really neat, And then I didn't have the transmittal letter, and I was so disappointed because Liebler hadn't put that in the file. And there's this guy in Michigan, Todd Vaughn, who I've known for 30 years. And you were talking about this business of individuals. Who collects so many documents? I have 5 storage areas. I'm paying all this money every month. I called Todd and I said, Todd, do you have the Liebler memo from the Ford Library? Everybody got the Liebler memo. Dulles, who went to Princeton, it's at the Princeton Library. Ford, it's in the Ford papers. Senator Russell, everybody, wherever their papers are, has a copy of the Liebler memo, which they ignored. So I asked my friend Todd Vaughn, and he said, yeah. I said, how many days will it take to get it for you? He said, well, I think I have it right here at home. I mean, this guy, Todd Vaughn in Michigan, and he went, while we're on the phone, and he went through his files, and he says, here it is, and he had the transmittal letter from 1966, which was so neat. So I was able to show it on the screen, you know.
Wonderful.
So, but people, yeah, a lot of people care about this, and are doing something about it. And this is where we are right now.
The other thing that you and I talked about in preparation for your lecture yesterday was showing the autopsy photos.
Yes.
And you made the comment that it's very, very difficult for people to look at those photos, but you said you've got to be willing to look at those photos because that's where you can tell what the crime was about and the alteration of surgery. You've got to look at those photos.
Well, yeah, not that the photos show the surgery the way they are because of the way they've cleaned it up a little bit, but the point is that the body was viewed, as I said in the Bismarck lecture, in two contexts, as a human being to be murdered and as a target to be altered. So on the one hand, he's alive and he's a human being to be murdered. Then, after he's dead, his wounds got to be fiddled with to create the correct diagram of the shooting. That's correct. So you got to get past the idea, because they're using Kennedy's body that way, so we got to understand, we got to put themselves in their shoes to understand their mentality, filthy though it may be, to understand what they did here. And so yes, and so the stare death photo was very powerful, and it became very important because that wound, which was an entry in Dallas, has been changed, you know, whatever it is, and it doesn't look like an entry anymore.
Right.
And you got to look at it.
Right.
And I got used to it. I mean, when I first saw the pictures in '82, when I got them, I said, oh, I can never publish these. So it took me 6 years, and I published them in '88. Earl Warren immediately said, nobody will ever see these pictures. I mean, but you have to, because the people who killed President Kennedy were looking at him in just that fashion, that we're going to kill this guy, and then we're going to punch this hole over here and that hole to make it look like the shots came from that building so we can promote this story about how he died. And if you can't deal with that concept, you can't deal with this crime.
Yeah. And the difficulty in getting through to the understanding of your view of this isn't evidentiary, it's psychological.
Yeah, it's not logical, it's psychological.
Yeah.
And I wrote that in Best Evidence.
Yeah. That's the key.
That's
people
the key.
People have a belief system that they can't penetrate.
You don't mess with the body after death. Of course you shouldn't.
Right.
You know.
I think it's that issue. I also think it's, well, as much as we are critical of our government, especially these days, certainly they wouldn't do this.
Well, it's not the government, it's the clique that was with Johnson or whoever.
Yeah.
That did
Well,
this.
yeah.
Well, okay, it's the government, but it's not the whole government.
Yeah.
It's the group.
So another way of saying that is I think people, it's easier for them to think it was the Cubans, it was the mob, it was some other entity, but not our own.
Well, not only
not inside.
Right. Not only that, but even when they come up with the idea that there's a false autopsy, they think, well, the doctor lied, and they blame the doctor. They blame it's a political a paper conspiracy. The idea that somebody punched a hole in the body or took bullets out, they can't deal with it. They don't either can't or don't want to, or think that that's absurd.
Right. Especially given it was done on Air Force One.
Especially Air Force One. That's the biggest indignity of all, if you want to call it that.
Right.
It's really bad. And it's the Flying White House.
Right.
Oh, you know, and the thing is that one of the things, maybe we should just throw this in, one of the things that's very serious, the guy that got me the memo, the Liebler memo, transmittal letter, Todd, he says to me, it's a week or two ago, we've been friends for 30 years, he says, where was Clint Hill at Air Force, at Love Field? I said, what do you mean? He says, you know, Jackie's her agent, his agent. She's his protectee, whatever. You know, how come he's not with her walking up the ramp onto Air Force One? And he said, where is he?
Where is he?
And I said, I don't know. And I said, and frankly, I'd never thought about it before, but somebody's got to be on the starboard side of the plane, and they have to be offloading that body or directing it. I'm not saying he's driving a forklift truck.
Right.
And so suddenly in Bismarck at this conference, I've been keeping track, and we have made a list of all these things he's saying that were not in the testimony. And one of them is, I was on Air Force One. I'm in the such-and-so picture. And this morning, I don't know if you got the picture, but I checked with the LBJ library. Even if there's another person, a piece of a person's head, that's not, I don't think it's Clint Hill, because they would have labeled it. They would have labeled it unknown person, or that could be Clint Hill. So here's the guy in 2013, and he knows what happened. The whole White House detail knows that the body was offloaded on the starboard side. That doesn't mean they're involved in the plot, but they all know because Johnson had to come up with some story. And the story, by the way, and we left this out, so I'll just say, the story was that Bobby Kennedy gave him permission to put his brother's body in luggage or something like that. Well, the whole White House detail knows, and they're taking it to the grave. It's what I call the race to the cemetery. And they're not going to talk about it. Now, one agent who passed away in 1993 said to two writers, there's so much I could talk to you about, but I'm afraid I can't talk to you about it. It's too hot. His name is Richard Stewart, Steuart. He's an agent, and he was in the Dallas field office, and this is what he said to two writers. He said, I know so much I could like to help you. I really would, but it's too hot even now. It's dangerous. They would know who it was. That's the kind of mentality it is. Now, I should say that when I called up Paul Landis, who I'm convinced was driving that car from Dealey Plaza to Parkland Hospital, and I got him on the phone in May 2010, I went through, it was amazing that I got him on the phone, and he listened to what I had to say. And I said, you've got to talk to me. I said, you're the hero of this affair. You drove the car from Dealey Plaza to Parkland. And there's this pause, and he says, thank you. But I don't want to talk about it. That's what I got on tape. Thank you. That's as far as he would go.
Incredible.
But I don't want to talk about it.